and welcome to Geological Society's webinar, Geosciences and the Energy Transition. I'm Mike Daly, present president of the Geological Society, and this is the first of 3 webinars to inquire into the role that the geosciences can play in the energy transition. But first of all, some protocol. The audience audio and video are turned off. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function on the lower bar of your screen. The chair of each session will be monitoring it and will either answer or pass on questions as time allows. The chat box will be open for informal conversations and is also monitored. Now, the plan for this introduction is I'm going to say a few words about energy transitions. Then Andrew Mackenzie will offer his perspectives on geoscience and the energy transition. Jen Roberts, convener of the meeting, will then launch the afternoon's program. So to energy transitions. As I said, this is a first of 3 short webinars to discuss the role of geosciences in what has become known as the energy transition. But over the past 300 years, there have been several energy transitions. Each has been driven by opportunity. The opportunity arising from a new energy source, mostly a new hydrocarbon molecule. And each transition has inspired new technology, and each has resulted in unforeseen outcomes. Today, we are experiencing a different sort of energy transition, one driven by a problem, the problem of accelerating environmental change. I'll say a few words about this difference, its origins, and its implications. In the 18th century, the increasing use of coal and the realization of the power of steam moved our agrarian economy into an industrial one. This industrial revolution was epitomized by the change from literally horsepower and wood to the far more energy-intensive coal-powered steam engine. At the turn of the 18th century, Savory produced the first steam pump that lifted water from coal mines. The pump became a steam engine, lifting both coal and people from the same mines. By the turn of the 19th century, William Smith had responded to these developments with a new technology for industry and agriculture, the geological map. Showing the strata of England, Wales, and parts of Scotland, he mapped the likely distribution of coal, iron, and clay resources throughout the country. By the time Smith published his map, steamboats were already defying river currents and navigating upstream. And steamships had replaced sail and were defying the wind and opening new ocean trade routes globally. Brunel noted that the carrying capacity of a hull increases by the cube of its dimensions, while water resistance only increases by the square. This meant big hulls really were better, more efficient, and essential for long voyages, if you could build them. By the 1870s, the era of iron hulls and steam-driven ocean liners was enabling the massive migration of people from Europe to the USA and Australia. At the same time, a transcontinental steam-driven railway crossed North America, and an increasingly complex rail network developed in the UK. At this new height of coal-driven mobility, the next energy transition had already begun. Oil-sourced fires had been worshipped for centuries. But oil began its industrial life in the mid-19th century. Kerosene replaced whale oil in lighting, and oil became a lubricant of steam engines. And geologists were beginning to map the world for oil seeps and associated rock formations. By the late 19th century, Edward Butler's petrol-driven internal combustion engine, complete with spark plugs and jet carburetors, was born. Rudolf Diesel's diesel engine followed shortly afterwards. And at the beginning of the 20th century, the Wright brothers flew, thanks to their super lightweight petrol engine. And just as the great steam-driven ocean liners were at their peak, the Navy was retooling for the First World War by transitioning their ships to fuel oil. By the end of World War II, the world consumed about 7 million barrels of oil. Today, it consumes about 100 million barrels of oil a day. That period has seen the building of a huge global industry, able to image geological detail down to 15 kilometers or more, produce oil and gas from water depths beyond 2 kilometers, and operate at pressures beyond 20,000 psi. This industry continues to grow in production and global reach, even as we now move to transition to a new energy system. Our old colleague coal is still around, but is being replaced slowly by liquid and pipeline gas. Reflecting on this brief look at history, two big things stand out as common to the previous transitions. Firstly, they were motivated by the opportunity of a new energy resource of increasing energy intensity. And their use was enabled by science and technology and geologists. And secondly, the consequences of each energy transition only became apparent with time. Mine pump engines led to coal-fired steamships that opened global trade routes. Kerosene oil lamps led to flight, put a man on the moon, and both of these energy systems have impacted our environment. The energy transition we are facing today will undoubtedly also have consequences we don't foresee. But the motivation for the transition is different from the past. It is not the next, more energy-intense resource. Our motivation is the problem of carbon and the consequent global decision to decarbonize our lifestyles and reduce our impact on our environment. This means a move away from our cheap, reliable, but problematic hydrocarbon molecules towards electrons. The only minor issue being, how will we produce those electrons and what do we need to do to make that happen? Lacking that next, more intense energy source, this is potentially a far more complex and uncertain transition than our recent historic ones, in all the dimensions of resources, finance, technology, and geopolitics. The new energy system will be developed on several fronts, all of which will require the input of geology, be it to understand our environmental impact and mitigate it, be it to secure the resources that support the generation of electrons from the Earth's minerals, wind, or sun, be it to enable the transmission and battery storage of those electrons, or secure the capture and long-term sequestration of carbon and nuclear waste we will generate in the meantime. Geoscience and resource security underpin each of these activities and places us firmly in the spotlight. We have much to do and many things to learn. Today's new energy transition is driven by a global narrative of environmental change and decarbonisation. And whilst the narrative seems largely consistent across heads of state and Western banks and investors, globally, our actions are not yet consistent with the words, with many countries continuing to grow their carbon usage and emissions. Why this schism? Well, I believe it's because everyone talks about the energy transition, but no one talks about the cost of the energy transition and its execution. For this to happen, we will need something akin to a just transition, meaning the tolerance of non-uniform change across many countries. What we in Western Europe talk of as the energy transition, much of the rest of the world looks at bewilderedly. This transition to a decarbonised energy system and how geoscience supports it in both developed and emerging economies is a theme we will pursue in the society over the coming years. This webinar series is the first step on that road. I hope you find it interesting and useful. Now, I'd like to invite Andrew Mackenzie to give us his perspectives on geoscience and the energy transition. But first, a word about Andrew. From a PhD and postdoctoral period in organic geochemistry, Andrew joined BP Research in 1983. 22 years later, he left BP as Group Vice President of Petrochemicals and became CEO of the Industrial Metals Division of Rio Tinto. 4 years later, he moved to BHP and was transported to Australia, where in 2013, he became the CEO of the world's largest extractive resource company. He retired from BHP in 2020 and is scheduled to become the chair of Royal Dutch Shell next month. Andrew is a Knight of the Realm, Fellow of the Royal Society, and a Fellow of the Geological Society. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us today, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Mike. That was a great introduction. And I think what I want to add to that in the next sort of 10 or 15 minutes, and by the way, I also have no slides, is a defense of the role of geology, both in the past and in the future, But probably more strongly than that, I want to celebrate and continue to make the request that we broaden our influence as a science that needs to stand shoulder to shoulder with the other basic science of chemistry and physics, and not some kind of derivative science or something that is second order. I was partly spurred into making these remarks because I recently listened to a fellow geologist feeling very guilty about all the fossil fuels that we had helped develop. And I should say this was not a geologist from any of the companies that I worked with. This was an academic geologist. And it really forced me to think about my own contribution to the world, of which I'm very proud, by the way, and the contribution of geology to the world. And I think Mike started me off very well by showing that we indeed have pioneered multiple energy transitions, not just from coal to oil and to gas and now future ones, but also previously coming out of wood and charcoal. And in doing so, we have moved humankind forward and created a quality of life and an absence of poverty still to be completed, which would have been inconceivable without the contributions that we've made. And I go further. At each step, we have reduced our carbon footprint. And all along the way, as Mike talked about, we've improved the efficiency of our extraction. We've reduced the impact of that extraction on biodiversity, and indeed on both the extraction and use of air and water quality. So we have nothing to be ashamed of, in my view, and plenty to be proud of. And in many ways, perhaps, as Mike said, our next challenge, the one that awaits us in the next phase of decarbonisation, is in fact the greatest one. And in my view, it may take more, not less geology than any of the other transitions that Mike described. Because we have to find a way of completing the decarbonisation to net zero as a planet, or as a world by 2060, sooner if possible in the developed world, and probably especially in companies who are concerned about how we can evolve to the next stage. But we're going to have to do this without any loss in the quality of life that we all enjoy today from fossil fuels, not just from the energy that they provide, but also from many of the unique materials that we, in many cases, are too quick to take for granted. Those of you who have heard me on geology in the past will be familiar with the reminder that everything that we can touch starts off by being pumped or dug up from the earth, or it's growing. But most of that stuff that is growing is fertilized in some way with stuff that has been dug up or pumped. We are so fundamental to life and will remain so. And there's something that we have to keep reminding ourselves of. Now, there's a number of things, and I want to expand more on what Mike had to say about some of the demands of this transition. I think first, we're going to require an order of magnitude more copper and nickel for transmission and batteries, and also maybe lithium, cobalt, and rare earths. We're also going to require a lot more steel, because renewable power requires a lot more infrastructure than fossil fuel power. And even hydrogen, because what we conveniently forget sometimes is that its density in the form that it will be used relative to its power is about a third of that of oil and gas. So that means bigger vessels to contain it, bigger vessels to ship it. And all of that means more steel, and that's more iron ore. And also, if we're determined in some way to make this steel with hydrogen rather than metallurgical coal, a topical subject here in the UK, which is a bit way off, that is going to require an even higher quality of iron ore that we take for granted today if we're going to reduce the carbon footprint of steel making. So, in many ways, when we talk about this transition, we tend to think of the transition from fossil fuel power to renewable power, maybe nuclear, Mike mentioned that word as well, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A session later. But actually, if you think about the materiality of our world, this transition is also about the transition from a fossil fuel world to a metals world. We're going to have to find a lot more big ore bodies, not small ones, because it's the big ones that allow us to minimize and reduce the spread of our impact in getting those metals to where they're needed to be part of the transition. And this is at a time when our skills in mineral imaging and modeling are advancing fast, in many cases learning from the successes that we created in the petroleum industry. But it is a broad request. And I skipped through a number of other things. We're going to need more concrete, which is more dolomite, more limestone. I know there's plenty of it, but it does have to be well mined. And I spoke as well about the fertilizers, most of which either will continue to be derived from oil and gas or will come from inorganic minerals. So that's number one. Now, the second big challenge as geoscientists that we are going to face is we're going to have to, if we're going to get to this 2040, 2050, 2060 deadline, unlock the opportunity for considerable amounts of carbon capture and storage. And the storage that is required is a massive engineering and a geological challenge. This is an industry that will almost certainly have to operate at a scale equivalent to the current oil and gas industry in reverse, which we support and enhance in many ways. And we'll have to do the same as we run our industry in reverse, because we're going to have to find ways and places to store CO2, which go way beyond the kind of experiments that are mainly done with old oil and gas reservoirs at the moment, or with ones that could have been oil and gas reservoirs but have just not been charged. Because for this stuff to work, it's going to have to be possible to do it with a much broader suite of geology, ideally under large industrial and power complexes in the rapid industrializing worlds of Asia, and I hope in Africa in the future. And we're going to have to think of quite different trapping mechanisms than the models that we use for oil and gas. CO2 in solution, CO2 reacting with rocks, a whole range of rocks, and being safe. And we shouldn't underestimate the material challenge in this too, because as we all know, CO2 is in water. It's quite a corrosive fluid, and is going to require, again, more of this world of metals, as well as, of course, the containment challenge as well. Now, the third thing that we're going to have to be part of is, if we're going to get to the sort of net zero in the times that I've laid out, is we're going to have a lot more biological solutions. We're going to have a lot more biological sinks. And we may also, of course, need to have more biological products, key fertilizers. And that's not just about preserving forests from deforestations, but it's the whole of land management to make it more absorbing of carbon, peats and soils. And we need to remind ourselves, and I am on a bit of a land grab myself here, but soil science is a branch of geology that will and should become more important as we're concerned not just about the ability of the earth to absorb carbon and keep it safe, but also, I think, to increase the nutrition of, for now, an ever-growing population. And I think the fourth challenge, which we as geologists are going to have to be up for, is more water. In many ways, this might be the resource that we start to see shortage coming earlier. Now, people might say we'll solve all that through desalination, more metals, more infrastructure, or indeed we'll drill for and you make more use of what we might call as fossil water. And we need to remind ourselves that that more sophisticated form of hydrology is also a branch of geology. So that's my kind of first push in the defense of geology. There's this massive new challenge for us geologists if we're going to help the world realize net zero by 2040, 2050, 2060. But I want to, I think, broaden our thinking about geology as I make a sort of paean for the subject into its contribution to culture, its contribution to the fabric of our society. Both my daughters studied history at university, but so did I. I studied the history of the earth. And I would put it to you that this is a history that matters too, a history that almost unknowingly has shaped many lives and peoples and their health and well-being. And it's also a history that gives us perspective. I think currently, in some ways, one of the biggest confirmations of the validity of climate change and the imperative for us to do something comes from the study of rocks. And that confirmation is in many ways more unequivocal than any other science. Not that we need to defend it very much, but I suspect what it is showing, and what we do need geology to reinforce, is that the chances of this being worse than we think it is are probably higher than we're currently planning for. And again, that comes back to the science of geology. But it's also a history, as we put it into perspective, that I think addresses some of the, at times for me, challenging perspective of other sciences. We don't live on a perfect planet. We live on a planet that cycles and has periods of imperfection and less imperfection over time. Whatever some of the naturalists might tell us, there are lots of periods in our planet which have been far from perfect. Not been a particularly good planet if you were a dinosaur at the end of the Cretaceous after the meteor struck. And it would not be a particularly good planet to be around for many of the species who were wiped out by the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And I'm also very aware of the excitement and the interest and the illumination that we can provide in giving people perspective of the imperative of climate when we think of the increasing confirmation, if you like, of the concept of snowball Earth. And that wasn't probably a great time to think about being on a perfect planet either. But a very other and equally important part of geology as history and perspective has to be paleontology. And we have to remind ourselves that without paleontology, which in my view is another branch of geology, there could be no grasp of natural selection. Although we're very excited right now about what might be happening in the Fermilab in Chicago, and where we may have a fifth fundamental force or a whole new physics, I think right now the greatest scientific construct ever produced by us was natural selection. And that is a concept whose origins lie in this society, of which Darwin was a member before he became a zoologist. So, lots and ways in which I want to talk more positively about the role of geologists in society, not just in enabling this change that is coming up, where our role is critical, but I think enriching the way we think about things. And as Mike mentioned, the middle part of my career was in mining. And in mining, those of you who've worked in that, and I'm sure plenty of you are on the call, our interaction with and respect for Indigenous peoples is vital. And these are peoples who I really got to know as a miner, and they taught me how to respect nature, not to revere it, nor to provide wilderness, although this has a place, but to use the land to create a better life for all, and to protect it forever, so all generations could benefit. So I'd like to tell you as geologists that you are the modern extenders of this tradition, and our guardianship extends to the core of our earth. And our custody does not just apply to the economic value that we can create, but also to our culture and also to the very fabric of our society. So we matter big time. We matter big time in the energy transition, which is a world of metals as well as a world of renewable. We matter because without us, we will not get carbon capture and storage right. We will not get the important biological solutions that are absolutely critical to get to net zero. And we matter as well about thinking about the whole health of our soils for all sorts of reasons. And think we matter as well in continuing to inform the other sciences, and particularly in natural selection, the science of biology. So we deserve to be a grown-up basic science alongside physics and chemistry. We deserve to have our own engineering discipline. We should be prepared to talk about geological engineering alongside chemical and mechanical engineering. We deserve to have TV programs that have the same appeal as life on Earth and astronomy. We have to find a way of getting people to study geology for fun and enlightenment, as well as for the contributions that I believe they can make. I have to say to you as well that this has to be a more diverse group. of more women, of more people of color. We are too white male as a discipline, and that's not good for us if we're going to appeal to the rest of the world that we are a very important part of the future. But when people are inspired by scenery, to write poetry and music, to paint and photograph, to walk, they should be awed, not just by the look of that scenery, by the deep forces inside our planet that have shaped that landscape. These are stories of wonder, and we don't often tell them simply enough for non-geologists. Modern geology allows that. So let's start telling these stories and be clear about the broader contributions that we have made and have yet to make, without which we would all, and the world would be poorer. So I'm really looking forward to hearing lots of examples of this in the next few hours. And thank you for letting me talk to you and get a few things off my chest.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. That was splendid. Hugely positive and inspiring challenges that you outlined for the geoscience contribution to the journey to net zero, but particularly the offensive and aggressive and yet reflective stance for the case of geology being a grown-up and basic science and its future importance in this transition, and the poetry and relevance on many dimensions. So great, very interesting and thoughtful talk. Thank you very much. There are a couple of Q&As that have been tabled, but time is moving on, and we've got a number of people sort of lined up on an agenda. So what we'll do is those questions will get put into the panels system, and they may reappear there as an opportunity to talk. Just now then, I'd like to hand over to Jen Roberts from Strathclyde University. Jen's a member of the convening committee, and she is going to explain the rest of the afternoon and introduce the first chair. So Jen, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mike. And hello, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm being a signpost just now, so you know where we've been and where we're going later today. Now, you've heard from Mike about transitions past and present and where the energy transition fits within the Geological Society's activities and ambitions. And you've heard Andrew's call to restore pride in the range of geoscience that serves our current and future needs, and that restores our planet too. And I love the description of geologists being planetary custodians to the core of ourselves and to the core of this planet. Incredible words and very powerful storytelling. So this afternoon, we will be putting into the spotlight the multifaceted role that geoscience plays in delivering our net zero carbon energy future. We aim to outline the recent advances and highlight future needs in geoscience areas that are critical for the energy transition. And in doing so, we aim to raise the profile of geoscience and showcase the interconnectedness of geoscience with the many disciplines and sectors that are necessary for a net zero energy future, and an energy future that, to use the language of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, leaves no one behind and ensures peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. And to catalyse progress, we need to bring people together through forums like this and to share and integrate knowledge, experience, approaches and solutions to the challenges and opportunities that the topic presents. And so these events will be leading to publications and other outputs, including publications in Geosciences journals like the new open access journal ES3. So today forms one of a series of events throughout the rest of this year and beyond, with other energy transition related events forthcoming too. Specifically, we have two future events that are part of this triptych. The next event is 7th and 8th of June, and we'll delve into energy transfer, injection and storage. We want to hear about your work to tackle challenges around the safe and efficient use of the subsurface for net zero aligned energy applications and key questions that need to be addressed. The abstract submission is currently open, but it closes soon, 26th of April. So please shove some of your great work in there, that'd be great. Then there's the third event, which is on the 6th and 7th of September, in which we'll be grappling with resourcing the energy transition on a finite planet. And again, that's participatory. Please do get involved. Abstracts are due by 26th of July. So pop those dates in your diary, register, submit your abstracts. We really look forward to your contributions and to seeing you there. A discussion meeting is then planned for about this time next year to set the research policy and action agenda for geoscience for the energy transition. And there will be other events, special publications and other types of activities going forward. This topic is gnarly, it won't be going away. We need to share and integrate collectively to ensure that geoscience and its connectivities enables the progress at the rate and scale that's needed. Those that are on Twitter can join or follow discussions using the hashtag GSLEnergy. And finally, just a note to say that this session is being recorded and information about how to access the recordings will be made available following the event. So on with today. We have a snappy big picture event lined up. Short sessions with each speaker telling us the role of geoscience and broad issues, challenges and opportunities that energy injection and storage, sustainable resourcing and societal, economic and political factors present. Each session has about 10 minutes of discussion and we utterly welcome your questions and contributions to the speakers. There is a comfort break scheduled and we expect that common themes will be mappable across these different topic areas and others might be overlooked. And so we'll be drawing those together in a discussion panel before we close. So now you know where we're going today. I'll pop a link into the chat to the programme so you can easily check on things as we go. But before we kick off on these topics, I did want to just say on behalf of the organising committee, what an absolute privilege it is that we have all of you here today. Our invited speakers here too as well. Thank you. The level of interest and engagement from such a breadth of attendees just shows the relevance of this topic. And thanks also to those behind the scenes or behind the screens, as it were, to deliver these events, in particular to Rob Knight, who's engineered and is orchestrating this tri-part series. Thanks and well done, Rob. Finally, thanks to our sponsors who allowed today's event to be free for everybody. So thanks a lot. Let's get the technical session started. I'd like to introduce Professor Stuart Haszeldine, Professor of Carbon Capture and Storage at the University of Edinburgh and Director of Scottish Carbon Capture and Storage. The first half of Stuart's career was spent extracting coal, oil and gas, but since 2000, he's been working in the energy and resources transition. Stuart is chairing session 2, Energy Transfer, Injection and Storage. So over to you, Stuart.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jen. And again, thanks to Andrew and Mike for excellent scene setting. And of course to Rob Knight for enabling all this to get organized, even though he's not appearing personally. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to energy in this evolving different landscape we're living in. That'll take about 10 minutes. And then I'm going to pass over to Jen Roberts, who will talk about the opportunities and consequences. And then she will pass on to Jon Gluyas, who will talk about new sources of energy which we're trying to realize and extract in a clean, low carbon way. And there'll be 10 minutes question and answer after that. So anybody who wants to ask a question, please put that in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. So we're trying to navigate, we're trying to explore new territory. We've got different constraints on us now to those which we had when I went to university and throughout most of my professional career. We've got very large constraints on carbon, environment, global responsibility, and much, much more transparency. And those are things which we've not been accustomed to dealing with. They're not at all bad things, but they're new ways. They need new ways of behaving and new ways of dealing with what we do. So where geology has come from, I think, is instructive because we carry some of that baggage with us still. And that baggage is shown by this group photograph on the left here, which is the Geological Survey of Scotland doing primary traditional, what we might call traditional geology, out in the field or in the great outside. And you can see that those people who are famous geologists from the Geological Survey mapped and recorded and interpreted the rocks they found outside. There were wild places often, before transport, before electricity, well before mobile phones. And it relied a lot on individual endeavor. And you can see that drew from a certain demographic and a certain type of person who went out and made the very fundamental discoveries like this map, which we still take students to train them in geology at the present day, this map of northwest Scotland, showing how the large amounts of the Earth work in terms of its geological history and its evolution. But that has created attitudes of how people behave as geologists, how the perception of people behaved as geologists, and the social mix of behaving as a geologist, none of which I think are persistent and true anymore. They are fading away, and they need to fade away much quicker. So geology is a proper science, as Andrew Mackenzie said. It's done in proper laboratories by proper scientists. But of the field, if you like, the outside is still a large part of what draws people to geology, and what a large part of what that perception is of geology. And the field has been a training for many geologists, and still is, the outside, for thinking not just in shapes, in up, down, sideways, and beneath the ground in terms of 3 dimensions, but thinking in 4 dimensions through geological time. And because of the prize and the goal of extracting fossil carbon, this endeavor has been funded massively in universities, in civil society, and in business and industry by hydrocarbon discoveries and extraction. And of course, that's produced vast amounts of wealth for humans. So each of us has the equivalent of 200 or 300 people working for us every day, 24 hours a day, because of that fossil carbon wealth we take out of the ground. 200 or 300 people. But that's also led to us developing new technologies. Here we can see beneath the ground. Here's a cross section through part of Alberta in Canada. We can see the reflected layers of rock. We can understand the geological history of evolution of these shapes and patterns. And that's enabled geologists to get very good at predicting, to predict from the sketchy information you can see at the subsurface, the scientific information you can derive from underground, to predict where to drill narrow boreholes the size of a telegraph pole, drilled down for 4 or 5 kilometers to hit layers of rock which may be only 10 or 50 meters in thickness. So this is a hugely successful scientific endeavor at the limits of human technology, and still is evolving at the limits of human technology to see and understand that underground. So that's useful geology. But there have also been plenty of bad consequences of that geology. And those bad consequences are now becoming more apparent, so that by mining large amounts of basic metals, so iron ore in Brazil, so we can see that that's not always been done correctly. It's been there have been catastrophic accidents. So here's an iron ore open cast mine pit in the landscape. Here's another one. The crushed iron ore and the washed iron ore has been the water used in that's been held behind a dam. That earth dam has burst, flooded, caused vast amounts of hundreds of deaths, vast amounts of contamination down to the ocean, $7 billion in contamination damages. That's not desirable, but it's a consequence of what we do, but it's also something we know how to now monitor, improve the monitoring, improve how we behave, improve the cleanup. We also know how to extract hydrocarbons on the right from beneath the oceans of the world, from beneath the land of the world. But different countries, different oil companies, different operators behave differently. So here has been and still is one of the adverse consequences, just flaring gas, which is supposed to be allegedly waste gas because it can't be sold commercially. So that's totally unacceptable now, of course, because that's both lost revenue in terms of money, but more especially that provides extra direct contamination and avoidable contamination into the atmosphere to increase the CO2 content of the atmosphere. So this is how it was. We've been very successful in extracting coal, oil and gas, major and minor elements, but we now have a different driver. As Mike Daly said at the beginning, we've got the driver that we have to change to avoid that carbon contamination. We have to find different ways in which we can gain benefit from the subsurface, the underground, and different ways we can use that underground. So the sorts of things which we have to do are think about how we're going to change from extraction to injection and storage. And for example, we may be using chemical energy into the future. So hydrogen as the chemical molecule, decreasing our carbon content, decreasing carbon from wood to coal to oil to gas, and finally ending up with hydrogen with no carbon. We may want to store that for several months underground, as is done with methane gas right now. We may want to we do want to capture and store the carbon dioxide which we emit from fossil fuels and store that underground for much longer periods of time. To most people, 1,000 years is unimaginable. 10,000 years is impossible. It was when the last ice sheets were here over the UK, but we have to explain what that means. And if we want to clean up our already existing waste from the electricity we've already used from radioactive waste, we have to be thinking of storing for 1 million years. And so these are different problems, different challenges, but there's a commonality of that multidisciplinarity of feeding in multiple factors and communication to all these challenges. So transitioning into that future is a transition from extraction continuing, but also injection starting up. So the two examples I'm going to give you of that are the carbon capture and storage example, where we may continue to mine coal, we may continue to extract oil or gas, but if we can capture the carbon dioxide at the site those are used, inject that carbon dioxide, we can gain the benefits of the energy and the wealth that energy creates, but without the disbenefits and the contamination of that energy use. And the challenge here is enormous. We have to predict, not understanding the past, we have to now predict into the future in three-dimensional space through time. So again, it's a four-dimensional problem, but we have to predict for very long times into the future with hugely accurate and precise results, so that less than 0.001% of the CO2 by regulation will be allowed to escape or move. None of it should escape, just to be clear, none of it should escape, but as the CO2 moves, we have to be able to survey that and predict that with extreme accuracy. The similar problem with radioactive waste, here's Forsmark in Sweden. This is Sweden's shallow temporary radioactive waste repository. This is the one that's been operating underneath the sea on this cutaway diagram, showing you how close to the sea that is and how close to the power plants and civilization that is. Disposing of radioactive waste has to be for 1 million years. And again, the legislation says that has to be increasing background radioactivity by less than 0.1% above normal radioactivity. So this is a huge challenge for geologists to predict forward, to understand that mineralogy, to understand those chemical reactions, to understand that water movement in time. And we can do that. It's very possible to do that, to make those predictions reliably, securely, to a legally defensible quality of evidence. And also mention that in the energy transition, we'll be using more and different materials. So in the original energy transition, I went to see a windmill at the weekend where I live in eastern Scotland. The windmill is built of wood, it's built of stone, it's built of cement, and a bit of iron holding the wheels together. So it's very simple, elementary input in 1700. But as we come through, we use more in the industrialization. We use even more elements for making motor vehicles in the present time that we've been grown up through our lifetimes. But now moving into wind power, solar power, high quality electronics, using that, generating that chemical and electrical energy and using that electrical energy, we need a whole panoply of elements which have to be discovered and extracted securely and economically. So the geologist is going to be responsible also for explaining that to people. So communication is very important. So here's a model on a computer of a carbon dioxide plume injected into a reservoir, rising up to fall and to be trapped underneath the seal. So we could spend several hours trying to explain that, or we could use a model of a multi-layered cake with a straw down the middle to try and explain that simply and understandably to ordinary citizens who have to be brought to enough of a comfortable understanding that they agree to proceed in this direction. And there are more challenges coming up in that direction. So here is a cartoon of deep sea mining, which is on the almost on the horizon, well, is on the horizon, almost entering into deep sea mining now. That's not been explained to the public. Who's going to explain that to the public? Will it pass scrutiny by the public? Do mining companies really know what they're doing? And do we have public permission to go and mine deep sea nodules to gain those rare earth and unusual elements I talked about earlier? So to finish off, the challenges are different to what we've had in the past. There's the technical scientific challenge of geological understanding and culture and scientific endeavor, but there's also challenges of predicting different sorts of attributes underground. How much can we inject? Where can we inject? How fast can we inject? Who actually owns the underground? Who owns the space We're accustomed to owning stuff, but who owns the space at different depths in different places? What happens if different people's ownership collides? There's a huge amount of information we've generated right of the underground, from metal mining in Europe through to coal mining, through to oil and gas. Who can keep hold of that information so we can use that for the future? Because we need to plan the underground just as well and just as accurately as we need to plan the above ground. And we need to plan for climate will be our biggest driver and our persistently increasing challenge. Climate up to and beyond 2100, and that brings different risks. We're accustomed to risks of volcanoes, from earthquakes, but we need to look at the risks from 2 degrees warming, and that will affect our resources and the way we have permission to extract and use resources. And we have to do that in a fair and just manner by recruiting, interesting and training geologists and geoscientists, fitting our equipment, retrofitting our equipment, and increasing that diversity and grouping of people. So geology into the future will be wider and more important technically. It'll be more inclusive socially, and change is inevitable. And that's it. Thank you very much. So I'm not going to take questions right now. I'm just going to pass on to Jen Roberts, who you saw introduce the first part. Jen's going to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities. So Jen is a Chancellor's Fellow in Energy at the University of Strathclyde, and her research really focuses, is built on the technical aspects of geology, but focuses much on the assessment, perception, communication and management about how people can be involved in geology. So over to Jen.
Brilliant, thank you, Stuart. Thanks for that introduction. And Stuart has also really nicely outlined some the key overarching challenges in the geoscience landscape. And so Jon and I are going to delve into a couple of example questions to highlight these challenges in action. The example that I'm talking about in the age of injection, as Stuart put it, is how do we make sure that the fluids that we inject stay or migrate where we want them to? Now, that's a slightly long-winded way of saying de-risking or managing subsurface storage, but we asked it just like that to kind of de-jargon, and because it's one of the most common questions that's asked when we're talking about subsurface energy storage applications for net zero. And I'm not going to attempt to provide a comprehensive answer to that question in 8 minutes or so, no. But I am going to highlight some of the key challenges and opportunities in answering these sorts of questions, and for which geoscience knowledge, skills and data play a really important role. So I'm going to talk us through some of these challenges and opportunities and sum them up before handing over to Jon. Now, ensuring safe containment is as important for applications like geological CO2 disposal, where the intention is to lock away the CO2 in rock formations, as it is for hydrogen storage, where the intention is that the hydrogen would be temporarily stored to be extracted again when needed, repeatedly or cyclically. So the first challenge to raise is that we will be managing the subsurface differently depending on the application. And that will have consequences for where the fluid goes and its containment and containment risks too. For example, for geological CO2 disposal, we're looking to trap the CO2 and so to demobilize it as much as we can to keep it locked away. For hydrogen, we're looking to recover that gas and we don't want to demobilize it long term. These are different fluids with different properties and behaviours, and we need to be equipped with robust knowledge about fluid flow and behaviours when injecting into rocks. And we're further down that path for CO2 than we are for hydrogen storage in rock formations currently. But the tools and skills developed for understanding oil and gas are translatable for furthering understanding of net zero geofluids, as I'll come back to in a wee bit. But tied to this point is that not only do we need to know how to de-risk the range of different applications, but also the range of subsurface environments that we might be talking about for these applications. These maps on the screen show selected distribution of stores and infrastructure for CO2. And these sites will vary, whether they are salt caverns for hydrogen storage, depleted gas fields, or other briny rock formations for temporary storage of hydrogen, or other energy storage options like compressed air energy storage or long-term disposal of CO2. They're going to vary depending on whether the formations that they're being stored in have new or legacy wells, the types, nature and extents of geological faults that the fluids might encounter, and also subsurface conditions such as pressure or stress, which sometimes sounds nice and simple, but can actually change spatially, both in depth, i.e. the formation you're in, and breadth, so where in that formation you are, and with time too, as I'll come on to in a bit. And rocks are very highly variable by nature. I couldn't possibly give a talk without showing some sort of heterogeneity in fault zones. Faults are fascinatingly heterogeneous and they're complex. This image shows a slice of the same fault, the Moab fault in Utah, either side of a road cut. You could spend ages looking at these beautiful images, but the main thing to note here is simply that there's a real big difference in a very short distance along the fault zone. And so it's not possible to know the fault properties, the rock properties or fault properties at every single point of an entire formation or along and across every fault that might be encountered in the subsurface. So we need to be prepared to handle geological heterogeneity and how we de-risk the subsurface for the range of applications and environments that the energy transition necessitates activities within. And we have quite a good handle of that, but gaps do remain, particularly regarding the risk that faults of new or old wells present for containment of injected fluids. But the main thing here is that the risks that we need to manage will be site specific. And how we will manage the subsurface and the effect of the energy storage has on the subsurface will change with time too. Therefore, the risks evolve with time and might interact. Stuart touched on this too. Might the pressure perturbations expected from, say, Stuart's CO2 storage site interfere with my CO2 storage site, say, over here somewhere? Or perhaps Jon's hydrogen storage over to the west? Might the brine displace change the efficacy of my reservoir system or compromise a possible containment risk? Or might the formations that I've used for CO2 storage actually be better placed as a hydrogen store, only I developed it first? I'm simplifying and somewhat jollifying, if that's a word, something quite delicate here, but it's to make or reinforce the point that the framework for 3D and 4D planning and decision-making about geological assets, that framework for long-term thinking is currently not there, as Stuart raised too. And we have data challenges too. For de-risking energy storage, we need to have a really good grasp of the cap rock and the overburden, that is the rocks overlying the storage formations. The overburden can be our foe. It can offer pathways for storage fluids to distribute away from where we intend them to be. It can also be our friend. The overburden can prevent any fluid migration through the cap rock itself or overlying low permeability sealing formations. It can redistribute and it can attenuate and it can offer storage in overlying or adjacent formations, trapping the fluids more effectively. And so we can look to the overburden to de-risk storage, and we can identify overlying stores to buffer any intended migration. We can look for pressure seals to signpost that no fluids shall pass. And that's a slight shift away from focusing on mechanisms of leakage and towards seeing the value of the overburden as a whole, as a system, in terms of offering multiple barriers and baffles of migration to the surface. But the overburden hasn't been well studied historically. That presents a data problem that presents challenge to ascertaining containment of geoenergy fluids. We've got a wealth of incredible data for some areas, depths, or geological features, and a data bias towards geological settings and geological systems that hold hydrocarbons. And we lack data for other areas or regions where energy storage would be needed and perhaps didn't have a hydrocarbon past. And we lack data for the overburden. So on the one hand, we have a data scarcity or data bias issue. On the other hand, we have a big data challenge that Stuart also alluded to just before. There have been huge advances in our capabilities to monitor the subsurface, to know where injected fluids have stayed or gone, and whether subsurface conditions are as forecast or whether there's new information to update our reservoir models. As Stuart said, we'll be watching injected fluids with vigilance. And there's been huge advances in monitoring because we need good knowledge and tools to monitor the subsurface, to manage the subsurface and operations, and for compliance with regulatory bodies and for assurance for a range of stakeholders, including the public. Now, these capabilities and the understanding that comes with it has been accelerated by studies of naturally occurring CO2 sites. Work around hydrogen natural analogues is in relative infancy, and also accelerated by pilot projects, field laboratories such as those in Australia, and geological observatories here in the UK, like the UK Geos, and on the horizon, a CO2 test site. These infrastructure investments have been really fundamental to advancing this knowledge and will continue to contribute to closing this gap. And that's a load of photos of me on my geo holidays, effectively. But these monitoring technologies, like those opened up by fibre optic approaches, there's actually now challenges around having too much data the need to handle and process and integrate lots and lots of data, which opens up opportunity for AI and other big data approaches to monitor the subsurface effectively and critically at a low cost. Now, within all this, there's the underlying point that we've been doing some of these things and developing incredible geological skills, abilities, technologies, databases, and so on for a very long time. We've got a lot of knowledge and we've got infrastructure too. And that infrastructure could get reused or repurposed for energy transition applications. So not only were these skills and resources key to the past, they are key to the present and to the future too. I'm kind of sabotaging Charles Lyell's quote there a bit, but it holds. These skills, techniques, data developed largely, but not wholly, for the oil and gas or hydrocarbon sector are totally relevant for net zero aligned energy transition applications. You can apply the same principles of observation and practice to different applications, and that's brilliant. We've still got some work to do to pivot those skills towards the energy transition. So bringing this all together, there are key challenges for de-risking the subsurface, some of which are that the subsurface is variable and how we manage the subsurface and the effects that energy storage has on the subsurface will change with time. Therefore, containment risks evolve with time and might interact. We've got a really good handle of some of these issues, but we currently lack frameworks for kind of 4D planning and decision making. Risk is site and application specific. We can use a suite of tools to assess and manage that risk though. And some knowledge and experience is more advanced than others for different energy storage applications. The ability to monitor the subsurface is a key challenge, whether to manage the operations or for compliance and so on. And we've come a very long way for CCS, but we still need to drive down costs. And for hydrogen and other energy storage applications, there's arguably plenty of work to do. There's data challenges. On the one hand, we have a wealth of incredible data. On the other hand, we have problematic data bias and data gaps. And for monitoring technologies, there can be challenges in handling and processing large amounts of data, and that needs to be resolved. And there's communication challenges too. I touched on this at the start, that questions and concerns around leakage will feature for energy storage applications, and also monitoring might be for assurance, not simply compliance or reservoir management. There remains gaps in risk perception, communication and management for energy storage, and for making sure that future geoenergy developments balance stakeholder values and needs appropriately and meet them where they are. But with challenges, there are opportunities. This is my final slide. First is that the past is key to the present, is key to the future. Many of the skills, knowledge, data, and so on for oil and gas are translatable. Geoscience and geoscientists are really adaptable because we can apply the same principles of observation and practice to different applications. So we need geoscience skills for the future. I need to support geoscience uptake and also skilling up or reskilling for net zero applications. The second opportunity is that we have more tools in the box than ever. We've got commercial sites, pilot and test sites, field laboratories, geological observatories, and incredible lab laboratories to advance knowledge and to hone more tools and skills. And this is a progressing space. We learn by doing. We've been doing many of these activities for decades. We've been really busy, but there's scope to shape things up, shape things out, and to support and accelerate knowledge sharing. And finally, and pertinently, as raised by Andrew and Stuart, there are opportunities to bring more voices into the room, enhancing uptake of geosciences, diversity within geoscience, and interdisciplinarity within and beyond geoscience. That's all really important to affect change and positive progress towards our energy transition goals. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Jon to tackle the next example question.
Okay, thanks very much, Jen. And whilst Jon gets his screen ready, I'll just introduce Jon Gluyas, is a Professor of Geology at Durham University and Director of the Durham Energy Institute. And Jon's had a long career in the petroleum industry, but is actually living the energy transition, because when he started off back at Durham, he was sponsored by the Dong and Icon companies, Dong being the Danish oil company, but now is sponsored by the Ørsted and Icon companies, making the transition from oil and gas into wind power. Has worked on low carbon energy for many, many years, and also en route discovered some significant helium resources to save our birthday balloons. Over to Jon.
Stuart, thank you very much indeed for a delightful introduction there. I'm going to take a slightly different view, if I may, in these 10 minutes I have. We've looked at materials with Andrew and Stuart. We've looked at fluids with Jen. But there's one sort of cryptic element which doesn't get a big amount of news worthiness, and yet it occupies a huge amount of what Stuart described as that comfort zone, that elevation of living standards within humanity, and that's heat. And I'm going to do it in a fairly parochial way by looking at our own local islands, a series of islands in the British Isles. So, and a prize for anyone who can spot all the film titles in the slides here. So, around about 50% of all the energy used in the UK is for heating, a little bit for cooling, but virtually all of that for heating. Half. That's every half a ton of coal if you're using coal, half a barrel of oil, or whatever it happens to be. 77% of that heat comes from burning fossil fuels. It's only natural, isn't it? My great-grandfathers would go out gathering firewood. My father and mother would be bringing coal into the house to provide heat. And that's the way it's developed in the UK, at least, and a number of other countries, particularly in Europe. A huge amount of heating energy comes from burning fossil fuels. The UK, it's very widely distributed. In the dash for gas that we had in the 1990s, saw widespread use of gas boilers having been derived from coal gas into North Sea gas. And some 22 million homes at the moment have individual gas boilers, a huge distribution of CO2, heat and CO2 producing equipment. Indeed, in the run-up to reduction of those boilers, which will occur from 2025, according to legislation, some 1.67 million were installed in 2019 alone. And taken as a whole, the greenhouse gas emissions in the UK from heat generation is 1/3 of all of our emissions, a huge quantity. And yet when you think about it, do we need necessarily to burn coal at hundreds of degrees centigrade or gas, similarly so, just to keep ourselves warm? Right? Maybe not. But where do we sit in terms of our use of fossil fuels for heating? Well, unfortunately, the UK sits pretty much towards the bottom of the league table. A huge amount of natural gas is used. Nearly all of the heating in the UK is from natural gas. And we have very few systems which use either waste heat or district heating and so on and so forth. The UK has recognised that and has suggested sequentially over the last few years, the UK government that is, that we switch to low carbon electricity, to hydrogen, to bioenergy, and by way of mechanism, heat networks. But this forgets the biggest heat source available to us on the planet, and that's the Earth upon which we live. It's a warm planet. We've heard about volcanoes and so on. We know about the activity of the planet in terms of its heat generation. And as it happens, something like only 15% of the heat generation capacity of the Earth in terms of its radioactive nuclides has been consumed in the past 4.5 billion years. In other words, it should last us. If we take a look at that, particularly in regard of the UK, and look at where we might use heat of the Earth, first of all, on the left-hand side, you have a chart which looks at the distribution of a number of heat accessible areas, hot granites, deep silane aquifers. And in yellow, the areas of heat demand, the major cities, the major conurbations. And unsurprisingly, perhaps for a reason we'll come to in a minute, they match rather well. And that reason, thinking about how we use heat, in the past, of course, much of it came from coal. We built many of our towns and cities on coal fields and mined the coal to produce both for heat and to export it. And what we now have, for example, are some 23,000 abandoned and flooded coal mines in the UK, all containing tepid water. Now, it's very low grade heat, but it's the sort of heat we can use for producing space heating in buildings. It doesn't need to burn coal at 500 or more degrees centigrade to warm your bath to 35 degrees centigrade, or your underfloor heating perhaps to 15 or 20. And it's not just the distribution of former worked coal mines, but if you think about the distribution of shallow aquifers within the first kilometre or so beneath the Earth's surface, the first few hundred meters may be accessible for potable water, but beyond that, we have huge swathes of aquifers occupying much of the space in England and the central belt of Scotland and parts of Wales. Each of these could have the potential for delivering warm water to be used by humans, both in domestic and office settings and in some industries too. So overall, in terms of heat, the opportunity is vast. The calculations we've done for the UK alone would suggest that if you re-engineer the way in which we live, in part with better insulation for new builds, cool running, underfloor heating and so on, not only that, but we can use these resources, the deep mines, the coal mines or the shallow aquifers, to store on a seasonal basis heat from either waste, industrial heat, or even solar heat. And even if we simply extracted heat from that shallow subsurface, given our current use of heat, it would last us at least 100 years. That's with very poor management indeed. Re-inject the water, as Jen has talked about, re-injection and so on, and harvest the heat. We're not in a position as a species to be able to deplete the heat of the planet. The opportunity is sustainable and low impact. And I'd like to leave it there just to have you think about how we might better use heat. Thank you.
Okay, Jon, thank you very much indeed. A different sort of geo-resource which we haven't really considered before in the UK. We've now, thanks to people keeping to time, we've now got a few minutes for question and answers. So I've got anybody who wants to put a question in, can please put that in the Q&A panel. There's several people chatting in the chat panel. Some of these would be quite interesting in the Q&A. Well, I'll pick up on one theme, and I'm going to ask for Jon and Jen to reflect on this. I've had in the Q&A, there are several questions along the same theme about communication. So communication is how can large companies, for example, oil companies, communicate better with the public and I guess with people who are concerned about the environment? Is that an issue which we can affect? Secondly, how can geoscientists get better at telling stories? And I think many people have been impressed with Sir Andrew's ability to tell a good story about geology and how that works and how that's fundamental to our human wealth. And also, should we not spend more time on teaching, on enabling geologists to communicate? So Jen or Jon, do you want to chip in with any response to that?
I'll try if I may. One of the things I've learned, particularly in Durham as part of the Energy Institute, which is a cross-disciplinary activity and interdisciplinary. We work together with engineers, with chemists, but more especially with the social scientists, the anthropologists and the lawyers and the business school. And in my brief 10 minutes, one of the projects I mentioned is to do with the redevelopment of these resources within flooded coal mines. And much of the impetus for doing that work came not from the scientists, but rather from the anthropologists. And Durham is an area where coal was king, phenomenal output of coal. The communities that once hosted coal mines, of course, are now bereft of that cohesion within the within the local society, and our anthropologists working with the former mining communities found that they were pulling us towards investigating the opportunity set in mine water heating very positively. In other words, absent of the geoscientists there, the anthropologists had uncovered the bit that would drive this forward in a socially acceptable way. Now, that is one small story for one element in a very big and difficult picture, but however, we certainly need those attractive stories, as Andrew spoke of, and we get them from time to time on the TV. We've got one or two celebrity geologists to appear there, but there are lots of different stories need to be told in lots of different ways, and we found one that worked for our local area and local community. So I think we just need to be diverse in the way we approach this.
Right, great. Thank you, Jon. That's a really good UK example. Jen, often thought of as being a different type of communicator. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's really prevalent. That it's quite telling that this has cropped up as a theme. I think it might be a key theme of this energy transition series around communication. And I think it's really interesting that we often pick it up as around communication with the public, as if everyone else has got it sorted. It's just the public where there's a communication problem. And there is a challenge. I think part of that challenge stems from the fact that we feel like we've got something really important to tell people. And it just goes back to information transfer and the information deficit model of understanding. So we need to reframe how we communicate, rethink how we communicate, try not to tell people information, meet them where they're at, understand what their lives are about, start the conversation from there, start the conversation from the people that you're trying to communicate with. And there's a whole range of different publics, a whole range of different stakeholders. But I think the other thing is that Jon really brilliantly pointed out is that to communicate well doesn't necessarily mean that we as geoscientists should be doing the communication. We should be working with interdisciplinary groups to think of different ways of approaching this. And actually, are the geologists the ones to be, we don't all have Sir Andrew Mackenzie's incredible storytelling powers, but communication, I guess the final thing I wanted to say, it's not just words and facts and figures. It's stories, as we've touched on. It's art, it's poetry. It's like actually seeing, it's a very powerful form of storytelling, like Jon touched on as well, is like seeing it in place in your locality, actually experiencing connection with your history of heritage of the place. So there's all these things, and there's no one solution, but we do need to work better at this in order to design a future that's fair for everyone.
Okay, thanks, Jen. And I'm going to just offer my tuppence worth, as they say. And so to spin that in a slightly different direction, to Jon founded his answer in historical communities who had a direct connection with the resource or a different version of the resource. And I'll just spin that to looking at radioactive waste disposal or nuclear waste disposal, which is often really, really difficult. And in the UK, it's proven to be really extremely difficult, in large part because of the lack of acceptance by local communities. And often that's because there is no local history of any experience with radioactivity or nuclear power or anything to do with that. So there's an immediate suspicion. So there's a lack of trust. So the communication has to overcome the lack of trust. But by contrast, in communities which have had experience with nuclear power or reactors or nuclear energy, then there is much better trust, and that can sometimes, or has proved to be, slightly more successful. And if we go to other countries like Sweden or Finland, then they have quite successfully managed to discuss this scary type of disposal with their publics who live in particular geological localities, and over a period of time have won the trust, have produced the evidence, have explained things, have re-explained things, have re-explained things, and managed to achieve a consensus and an agreement. But the other lesson from that is that that's taken maybe 20 years or even 30 years to build up that level of trust and communication. And part of the point then I was making in my presentation was, I think as we go into different types of energy in the future, whether it be geothermal or whether it be siting wind power or building new pipelines or different transmission systems on and around the UK, that communication has to be explicitly involved, not just from a few individuals, but as part of the embedded company and business outlook to engage with the communities a lot more closely. And I think there have been a couple of comments on that in the chat and the questions. I'm going to move on to a slightly different question now. Is I can't remember who asked it anyway. Somebody asked, it was Philip Patterson asked, in the recent past, we've been accustomed to working with oil companies who make extremely large profits and can spend a lot of time, effort and money in doing whatever they want to do. If that is decreasing, is that a decreasing resource? Will there be less money available? Will there be more pressure to do things more cheaply or differently or with reduced scope? When we're dealing with different types of companies, maybe with wind power companies, renewable energy companies, or with companies which don't have such big global bank balances. And I wondered if Jen or John wanted to comment on that. How might companies in the future, energy companies in the future, be different to deal with?
I can have a go, Stuart, though. Jen, please do add to this. I think there are two aspects to this. First of all, both Mike and Andrew touched on the energy density within coal and oil and fossil fuels in general, in that being high energy density means that margins, when you are successful, can be very high. And that's essentially what we've been talking about in terms of the feed, which then comes into further research and investigation. And for sure, things like, you know, a barrel of hot water not only carries much less energy than a barrel of oil, but the margins on operating that will be so much smaller. So you could think that with non-fossil fuels, that because of those margins are smaller, the consequential feed to research and development will be smaller. But there is a flip side, and you illustrated the flip side, Stuart, with the picture of the dam in Brazil. And the dam in Brazil burst, killing some 300 people or so. And so when it comes to the impact of that, not only on people's lives, but also on business continuity, there's another angle to look at, and that's maintaining the Earth Watch, as Andrew talked about it. And there, whether the commodity price is high or low, the value of people's lives is still the same. And I think so there's a different way of looking at where we might get continued funding from to continue researching how the Earth operates. And it's from the equity funds and insurances and areas like that, not necessarily the energy companies.
Okay, so that's good. Again, different way of behaving into the future. Just quickly call on Jen if she's got a couple of thoughts very quickly, and then we're up for time, finish time. So Jen, quickly.
Very cognizant of time. So I say it's a really interesting question. I think it's one that I have also been pondering upon and thinking about how we're going to do energy differently into the future, and how might we be, as John pointed out, you know, the research investment, that's one of the SDGs, it's SDG 8, one of the indicators is investment in R&D, but I think that the investment and portfolio might be changing depending on the profitability of these businesses. But we have also just talked about the need to kind of localize energy systems and work very long-term, kind of relationship building with communities. So I think there's a chance to just do energy differently, as well as this technically differently in a lower carbon world.
Okay, Jen, thanks very much. So I'm going to call that session to a close now. We're up for time. So thanks to Jen, thanks to Jon, I suppose thanks to me for giving introductory presentations. Sorry we couldn't to handle all the questions. There's a lot more coming in on social attributes, social linkages, people starting to get interested in that. So future questions may come back to that. And I'm now going to pass over to Mike Stephenson, who's going to chair the next session looking at resources and hydrocarbons. Mike Stephenson from the British Geologic Survey. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Stuart. I'm chairing session 2, which is on resources and sustainability. So we have 2 great talks in the next 20 minutes. And also we have some time for questions, to answer questions. Some brilliant questions been written down already so far, but please keep those questions flowing because we would like to get some really good questions to our speakers. So the 2 speakers are Frances Wall and Bethan Pugh. So Frances is very well known for her work in the circular economy, or her work in technology metals, including critical raw materials. She's also an expert on ore deposits, including rare earths, niobium, tantalum, phosphate deposits. She's also worked a lot in responsible mining, including ethical sources of metals and public perception of mining and energy. And certainly recently, she's quite well known for regional development of georesources in Cornwall and southwest England. So what we have now is a great talk by Frances on resources on a finite planet. Over to you, Frances.
Thank you very much, Mike. I hope I can fulfill your confidence in this talk. So here we go then with the next 10 minutes, and we're doing the inorganic part of this session in the next few minutes here. And as I hope you can see from this slide then, the resources we're talking about, we'll be talking about what we need to make wind turbines and solar panels and electric cars, things to decarbonize the economy for the energy transition. I think the first point here is maybe when we think about nice renewable energy, it's kind of something we get for free. And of course, we don't get anything for free. Everything that we need to generate this energy, we need stuff to make it out of. And just like we need to grow food and farm, so over the whole history of humankind, we've been taking stuff from the earth to make and do things with. And it won't be any different in the future and in the energy transition. There's nothing particularly wrong with that, but every graph that you see about how much stuff we'll need does an exponential upwards shape to it. It doesn't matter whether that's major commodities like cement or iron or aluminium or the minor metals. Everything goes exponentially. And on this graph here, I've got a couple of examples. You can look at any of these, but these only actually go up to 2020. So these are historical things and showing that these graphs are already going that way. And the drivers then for our need for minerals and metals are, first of all, the number of people on the planet. And the more of us there are, the more stuff we will need. So as we go on to 10 billion people in the planet up to 2050 and beyond, so we can expect these graphs to go upwards. And the second is a positive message, of course, that we can now afford to do more things. There are more middle class, if you like, people who can afford electricity and transport and things, and that also drives these graphs forward. And on top of all of that, as has already been said, as we go into the energy transition and a decarbonized economy is an age of materials, an age of metals that's absolutely reliant on these minerals and metals. And to give you an example then, just to take one, which is at the top of the UK manufacturing agenda, definitely at the moment, is if we think about electric cars. And here it is looking quite like a normal car with steel and plastic and aluminium and rubber. But an average electric car has about 4 times more copper in it than a petrol or diesel car. And along with that comes all the less usual elements, things like lithium in the battery and cobalt and graphite and manganese and nickel. And in direct drive motors, neodymium and praseodymium and dysprosium, some of the rare earth elements that you hear about. So these are metal intensive instruments, if you like, these cars, and they contain a range of things, the major metals, and also these less usual things that as geologists, we're not so well educated about. So that's our first challenge then, and we're enjoying this very much, is learning about a much wider range of mineral deposits. But just to stay with the challenge for a minute, rather than produce lots of graphs, here's one quote that I really like from the World Bank. 550 million tons of copper, they reckoned, has been produced in the last 5,000 years. And in the next 25, we will need to mine about the same amount again. So these figures really huge. And here's everybody's favorite graph that Stuart already showed this afternoon, because besides needing more metals and minerals, we're using this wider range of metals and minerals, things like the lithium and cobalt and rare earths. And as we make more complicated energy transition devices and electric cars and all our digital devices too, we're using this wider range. So that's our second pattern. Any of those, like lithium or rare earths, we don't need in very big quantities. And so they might only come from a few mines in the world, and so they're absolutely essential to manufacture these things. They can be vulnerable to supply disruption. And this map here that you started looking at is the European Critical Raw Materials 2020 list plotted on a world map. And you can see the countries that the various critical raw materials come from. And if your eye has gone to the right, you'll see that while the West was busy, maybe investing in high-tech manufacturing and service industries and things, China was busy remembering about raw materials and dominates the supply of a huge range of these critical raw materials, many of which are needed for the energy transition. And so this brings critical raw materials very much into the geopolitical agenda then, and produces a really nice challenge for geologists, because this is today's map. I could show you a map of deposits of any of these and it would be much more widespread. And so for geoscientists, we certainly have a role in diversifying supply of these critical raw materials by going out and finding new deposits. But as we go out and we go through these steps of finding, that's exploration geologists, these deposits, and going through to mining, processing and extracting, today that's all has to be done in this cocoon of environment and social responsibility. So as geologists, we have to think right from the very first stages of planning which deposits to go and look at. We have to be thinking forward as to what will happen when they're mined and processed. And A, choose the ones that have the best environmental characteristics, and B, plan, and you can do this right in the first stages of exploration, to look forward with things like life cycle assessment to predict what will happen, to make sure that we tackle the challenges of producing these metals and design the very best performing mines. And that goes for social responsibility too. And with respect to minerals, the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, are very complicated, and mining will contribute positively to many of these goals, and if you're not careful, also contribute negatively to many goals as well. And so this balancing act and getting the environment and social performance right is absolutely a challenge for geologists. And working with our colleagues, there's lots that we can think about in the future. What about using byproducts much better and reducing waste, thinking of new ways to mine? Automated mining is here, narrow vein mining, drilling without needing to make big spaces and lots of waste at all, getting things out of solutions, joining up with geothermal energy. All of these are coming, and it's a really big, challenging and exciting space to be in. Because I just wanted to put this slide in to say absolutely that the characteristics of rocks that we look at as geologists really affect how they perform when they're mined, and are absolutely crucial to responsible mining and responsible sourcing. And if I take some of my favorite rocks, so here's some rare earth deposits, for example, and you don't need to assimilate all of the things on this slide. You can read them if you like rare earth deposits. But the point I want to make pretty pictures is ore deposits come in all sorts of shapes and forms. There are sands here, there are weathered deposits, there are hard, fresh rocks here, and they all have different characteristics. And we need to weigh those up, and geologists work out how they will perform when they're mined and which are the most responsible supplies to produce for the future. And this kind of opportunity has been picked up by the World Bank. Here's the Climate Smart Mining Initiative. And there are countries across the world, including the UK, I might say, but many developing countries who really want to take advantage of this opportunity to produce the metals and minerals that we need for the energy transition. And so thinking a little bit more about responsible sourcing, then a lot of what the mining industry has been doing over recent years with actually a lot of success. So things are much better, but as we saw with that Brumadinho slide, all is not perfect yet, and there's still lots more to do, is thinking of what's on the left of that slide. How do you be a good citizen as a mine with respect to the local community and the national environment and your banks and shareholders? And the last point I want to make is that as geologists, we now need to think about the value chain from the mine as well. Because in responsible sourcing, it's high profile issues like cobalt and child labour that I'm sure you've heard about that are picked up by consumer activists who go to the high profile manufacturers. They don't know the miners, but they can approach those. And then that goes down through the manufacturing supply chain. And I think we're seeing now a much bigger pull for responsible sourcing right back to those very first stages. And as I said, as geologists, we can be very much involved in that. And we need to get involved in the materials stewardship of our materials. Recyclers are raw materials providers, miners are raw materials providers, and I think we'll see a much better integration between those areas. And the UK has just had a big circular economy initiative with major metals and technology metals included to join up these value chains much better. And as geologists, we're right at the beginning of that, and we can really, together with our other colleagues in mining, I think, take a hold of this materials stewardship category, because the materials we're producing are really super sustainable. Metals, by and large, they don't go anywhere. If you can keep using and reusing them, then once they're out of the ground, they can be used forever. So although they only come once out of the ground, they are really the one of the epitomes of sustainable materials. So here's my some roles for geoscientists. And in minerals, we can help establish alternative supply chains to diversify supply. We can help achieve responsible sourcing, and we must link better to the value chain and talk the same language as manufacturers, including the circular economy, so we get it right absolutely from the start. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Francis. That was a very interesting talk. Just a reminder to everybody, we have some really nice questions, but to keep those questions coming in, we'll be answering them after the next speaker. So I'll introduce the next speaker. That's Bethan Pugh. So she's currently business manager for Energy Transition Upstream UK in Shell. She's worked on Brent field decommissioning, on the Brent Delta single lift and onshore dismantlement. She's a chartered project manager and civil engineer with a master's from Cambridge University. She's also worked in some very out of the way places, including Siberia, Qatar and Kazakhstan. And she's worked in many commercial and technical upstream roles in the oil and gas business. So I'll just introduce Bethan to give her talk.
Thanks, Mike, and afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be here today, and great to hear from Francis just prior to this on the sort of the minerals or metals element, and already we hear stewardship coming in there, and I'm going to build on that with that theme on from a hydrocarbon perspective and responsible stewardship in that topic. So for me, it is absolutely vital, because oil and gas is going to remain a key part of the energy mix, even in the UK, for many years to come. And as we heard throughout the talks, addressing climate change and the implications of that is the greatest challenge that we have of the day. So for me, responsible hydrocarbon stewardship is key. I'm based within our upstream operation in Aberdeen, and I lead an energy transition team. So here we're actively focused on looking at reducing our own operational emissions and also to building on new businesses such as hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, which are also key to delivering on the energy transition. So we're looking at that kind of full value chain. So today I'm going to cover the role of oil and gas in a net zero world, the importance of stewardship to reduce operational emissions, and also the significant role the industry can play in supporting other hard to abate sectors in reducing their emissions and achieving net zero. So first of all, I'll just share a little bit of Shell context. So in the UK, Shell's growing our low carbon mobility and power businesses. Today, I'm going to focus on the upstream business. So here we're delivering the energy that our customers need today and will continue to need through the energy transition. But we're also investing in the nascent businesses of CCS and hydrogen, which are going to be key to delivering on the energy transition. And we're also investing in nature-based solutions. But let's go into kind of the energy trend. So what's the role of oil and gas in net zero? So we see scenarios from the IPCC and Shell, like there are many different scenarios of the future, but they all show a role for oil and gas for right out to 2050 in a net zero future. We see the role of energy efficiency being really key in helping to deliver that increase in energy demand that we're going to see. And deep electrification from renewables is one of the largest levers as well. And we saw recently there was a record broken over Easter weekend. You may have seen that the UK grid reached the highest percentage of low carbon power sources, I think over 80%, at a point in time over Easter weekend. So we're kind of breaking those records within the UK. But all scenarios show a role for molecular fuels in the future, and within that, a role for oil and gas as well. So then the question is maximising economic recovery, particularly in the UK, consistent with net zero? So we heard some facts and figures from Jon earlier. So similarly, currently at the moment, 75% of the UK's total primary energy needs are supplied by oil and gas, and 40% from domestic production. So there's a big role to play right now. The Independent Climate Change Committee's analysis do show an ongoing need for oil and gas through the transition to net zero, albeit at significantly declining rates. So the charts are going down in the other direction from some of Francis's, but we do see from the CCC that we're going to need more oil and gas than we can produce still in 2050. So focusing on that dual kind of balance of our domestic supply, but also addressing emissions is really, the operational emissions is key for meeting climate targets in the UK. We also then would maintain UK skills and investment, and those skills, and we've talked also about the role, of course, of geosciences within that, those skills are key to the energy transition and development of those new businesses, which are going to be key to that, such as CCS and hydrogen. And what are we doing about it? So the Oil and Gas UK industry body, as well as the North Sea oil and gas industry. So last year, there was real leadership shown by setting ambitious targets on operational emissions reduction. So we committed to working with the government and regulators to reduce our own emissions by 50% by 2030 and to be a net zero basin by 2050. So that's sort of a first in the world to make that kind of industry commitment. But it's only the start, because the emissions from the oil and gas industry at the moment contribute to 4% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. But obviously we saw also from the same comments that Jon made on heating, at the moment 80% of the UK's emissions are coming from the use of oil and gas and fossil fuels. And those tend to be in 4 key sectors: industry, heating, power and transport. So most of their emissions, when you consider the full value chain, are coming from the use of the energy we sell. So we very much see that we need to also help our customers cut their emissions when they're using our energy. And that also links into Francis's point about, where does stewardship start? Where does it finish? And you need to look along the whole value chain. So I'll dive a little bit more into what Shell's doing. So in February this year, Shell set itself a global target to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050. And becoming this means that we will reduce our emissions from our operations, but also from the fuels and other energy products that we sell to our customers. It also means capturing and storing any remaining emissions using technology or balancing them with offsets. So in order to do this, we need to transform our business to meet this target by producing more low carbon energy, such as charging for electric vehicles, hydrogen, or power from renewable sources. But also working with our customers as they make changes, including in sectors that are hard to abate, such as aviation, shipping, road freight, and industry. So, I really, each of these elements for me are part of responsible hydrocarbon stewardship. It doesn't start or stop with our own operational emissions. When we look at what we're doing in upstream UK, so particularly what my team are looking at, I feel we've really taken a quite structured and proactive approach to responsible hydrocarbon stewardship. Within the last 12 months, we've set an ambition. What do we want to achieve? We've determined the building blocks that we're going to need to deliver on reducing our emissions and building new businesses. And we've needed to understand both the internal and external drivers within that, because there are dilemmas. You can't make ambitions and deliver on ambitions in isolation. So for me, it's really about bringing that energy transition lens into decision making as a business in both the short term and the longer term. And how you do that really depends on from company to company and also where you are as an organization in your thinking in that space. So in order to meet the 2050 target that we've set globally, definitely we need to already be setting that course and taking action now, especially in the UK, where we also want to reduce our Scope 1 emissions in line with that industry target of 50% that I mentioned by 2030. But for us, it's not about a managed decline. It's also about filling the production funnel. And that needs to be then consistent with our emissions ambitions. So we need to sort of balance that decarbonisation with still kind of sustainable and carbon resilient growth. And then we also need to be helping work with our customers on their decarbonisation. So within this roadmap, I have various different building blocks of delivery, and I'll pick out a couple more just to bring it a little bit more alive as to what we're working on. So the item in blue, it talks about projects and portfolio delivery. So what does that mean? So for me, it's delivery of a carbon resilient portfolio. So we've got to deliver best in class projects. Again, we've heard that mentioned a few of the talks so far this afternoon. So best in class projects, and also evaluation of that future growth to make sure that it's consistent with not only your business, your bottom line, but also with your responsibilities and your ambition in that regard. And then we see in the UK, so and some people will be highly familiar and some may not have heard of it, but so this year the Oil and Gas Authority, our industry regulator, issued their new net zero stewardship expectations for operators, and there's also been the recent license review for new exploration. So for me, that really points to, to succeed in this area as a responsible operator, you need to understand and develop your own internal checkpoints. And you also need to respond to those external checkpoints, which absolutely in the UK are being very much defined and strengthening all the time. So you need to understand both those internal and external checkpoints. You need to create them if you don't have them already in order to maintain the license to operate. A second key building block here to draw out is around major abatement projects. So for us, this covers particularly electrification and carbon capture and storage. So we joined the Acorn CCS and Hydrogen project in 2019, along with other industry partners, and it's led by Pale Blue Dot. This is the anchor project to the Scottish Industrial Decarbonisation Cluster, and it has massive potential for the region in this net zero trajectory that we have. And we're also partners in Teesside and South Wales clusters. Further to CCS, we're studying electrification of a number of either existing or future assets. And electrification has the potential to deliver millions of tonnes of abatement for the oil and gas industry across the UK. But it does present a dilemma because generally we've got a mature asset base and it's really critical to get the timing right that we need the right policies, regulatory environment that then enable quite large investment decisions to be made when we're on quite a short timeline for remaining life of the platforms. Also, responsible hydrocarbon stewardship can't be considered in isolation. So we really need to collaborate. The role of policy and regulation are critical in delivering on the energy transition. We need to release investment, mature these key projects, and these projects, CCS, electrification, hydrogen, they're critical for all of us to reach net zero, not just sort of in isolation for any one particular sort of company's ambition. So kind of how are we going to get there? And I know that there'll be a little bit more in the next session as well on policy, but I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes just flagging up the North Sea transition deal. So this was announced in March. This is the first of its kind by any G7 country, and a striking example of the UK showing global leadership on climate change ahead of COP26. So this is an agreement between UK government and the oil and gas sector in the UK. So in it, and there are 5 sort of pillars here highlighted, and you can find more information online, but just at a very high level, it's about the industry as a whole committing to move urgently towards a low carbon future and to show global leadership in really kind of putting all of our skills and expertise to support the UK reaching net zero emissions. But it's also then working with the government and the government committing to create an internationally competitive and level playing field which prioritises UK energy, jobs, communities and businesses, which then will encourage innovation and sustain that investment that we need to reach net zero. So, you know, in conclusion, then oil and gas has got a strategically significant role to play in a net zero world and in supporting the UK and Scotland reaching net zero. You know, we've got this track record, much of which built on sort of all of the extensive geoscience expertise. We've got this track record of innovation, all of the thousands of skilled people that we have. We deliver world-class energy projects, very complex and challenging. You know, we have the skills and the the energy to drive new collaborations, which are going to be needed quickly in order to deliver on the energy transition. But we also acknowledge that we need to earn the right to play that role. By acting on our own emissions and being able to show that our contribution we can make beyond that to broader decarbonisation. So I'll just pause there and open for discussion.
Thank you, Bethan. So we have about 6 minutes for questions. So we have a nice set of questions. The first one, I think, which appeared and then disappeared, I'm not sure why, but the question was really, and I think it's a good one for both of you, is can we really expect to have an energy transition and maintain our very high living standards, at least in the developed world? Is it reasonable to expect us to carry on as we are carrying on, or can we not really think about energy transition and somewhat changes in our ambitions in terms of living standards? What do you think? Francis?
Yes, I can have a go at that. Yeah. Can we carry on as we're carrying on? And the answer is no. So we have to get much better at being more careful with our materials. And so we do need a lot more circular economy thinking. And I think that, we can get much better at that with the new technologies. I think that's a tremendous opportunity as we bring in resources like lithium and things. We need to make sure that they're actually going to stay. And there's some fearsome regulations coming in about the need to recycle battery materials, for example, at their end of their life. And that's a huge technological challenge because no one really knows how to do that very well. We make such complicated materials for people, for the recyclers to work with. But I think that those will have to be solvable challenges. So no, we can't carry on, but can we maintain a high quality of life? And I'd like to be positive there and think that yes, because I think as consumers, as ordinary members of the public, we will kind of insist on that. I don't think people are going to stop enjoying what they're doing, but I think we'll certainly get much more efficient at reusing materials and not be as wasteful as we are at the moment. And I think there'll be good solutions to that we will have to embrace.
Okay, so living standards shouldn't be affected, according to Francis.
Yeah, but
I won't hold you to that. Bethan, do you have any feelings?
Just to build on that, I mean, all scenarios show globally, how much more energy we're going to need. So it's clear that we will need more energy, and part of that is to support an increasing in living standards elsewhere, right? That people then will, look towards the more developed countries and say, kind of, how can we build ourselves up to that level? So for me, it's about how can we use the energy and how do we deliver it? And how can we take the learnings that we've had through the journey that we've had and been on and sort of help other countries to kind of leapfrog some of those phases so that they're kind of already maybe kind of ahead of us or they miss it. I also believe we're going to need to make personal changes. Some of that's just also my sort of personal opinion, but you've also seen, in the last year, the changes that have been forced upon us. Here we all are working from home, not jumping on a plane to come down to, present in London. So I think we can make changes and that there is a role to play. And when we've looked, even within my own team at our kind of personal carbon footprint, how much of that is within your own control, but also how much of it is not down to the consumer, it's to do with the systems. And I think that's also the role that we, in science and engineering need to play and to help the consumer, whether industrial or sort of domestic, to be able to kind of have access to those lower carbon choices.
Yeah. Another nice question for both of you, and then I think one quite pointed one from Francis. So the question is, no, don't worry. What advice would you give to a student or an early career geoscientist when it comes to starting a career as a geoscientist during the energy transition? Should they be happy, or should they be afraid? What's your view, do you think? Is it a great future for young people starting in geoscience?
I think we have to be positive, don't we, Bethan, and say, yes, there are all kinds of challenges that I think we're outlining this afternoon, aren't there? So yes, there's a need for geoscientists, and I think there's great careers. And Bethan's, of course, been talking that we will still need oil and gas for the foreseeable in some way. And I think that's maybe when young people look, they see fossil fuels as some kind of villain in climate change. And so they think that's what most people who do geology degrees go on to do. And of course, I think as we're showing this afternoon, that is still needed. We'll still need some oil and gas geologists, but there's all these other new opportunities coming with energy transition. We'll still need people to go and look at minerals, but there's all these underground reservoir engineering challenges, carbon capture and storage, geothermal energy, all of that's coming there. All the same environmental careers are all still there. All the same engineering careers are still there. So I think we can be positive about that and encourage people to come into the geosciences.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've seen from all of the presenters so far, like what is happening now and what's coming next is, another big, you just kind of want to say seismic change, but I'm an engineer, you can forgive me the poor geology puns, but there's so many opportunities. And there was another question that I was going to bring up in the next panel about the collaboration required, but not just between businesses, but between sectors, between governments and regulations. Also, I think makes it potentially much more interesting where we are right now, because it is that cross kind of, is not so much, okay, here's a giant industry, you go into that and just work in isolation. That's what I'm telling our whole campus, that you need to understand the external context and every single traditional opportunity that you're looking to develop. Now you need to have this energy transition lens and that responsible stewardship lens on that, which is quite new to a lot of people. So actually I really embrace the fresh perspectives that we get in from our younger professionals and try to harness that as much as I can in the work that we're doing at Shell.
Okay, very last question to squeeze in for Francis. So what do you think the potential for lithium extraction is in Cornwall?
Okay, that's an easy one. Yeah, so there is great potential for lithium extraction in Cornwall. Two types of deposits: lithium micas in granite and lithium in geothermal waters. Both of those are pretty new as forms of lithium deposits, so they need a huge amount of innovation, technology to take them forward, and our exploration projects are still at quite early stage. They've both attracted government funding recently to take them forward, and so watch this space. There's definitely potential, but it's a long journey for companies to get those technologies ready, but it's a very exciting time, so see what happens. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, on that very positive note, particularly for Cornwall, I will wrap up this session. So we have, I think, about a 20-minute break, 19-minute break until 3:15. So thank you very much to Francis and Bethan. Brilliant talks and also some really nice questions. I'll leave you now and go and have a cup of tea.
Thank you.
So just coming back from the break, hope everyone's had a chance to recharge their coffee cups or cups of tea. Right, so I will kick straight into session 4. So we've heard already some of the themes that we'll be covering now. We've got a really distinguished and widely published set of presenters coming next in session 4. We've heard that we can't deliver the energy transition in isolation, whether that be industry or sort of science and academia, and the importance of communication. So I think it really then leads into nicely this topics on social awareness, policy and economics. So we've got 3 speakers for you now, starting with David Reiner. So I'll just introduce David briefly and then hand over to you. So David is a political scientist and senior lecturer in technology policy at the Cambridge Judge Business School. He's advised government, industry and NGOs on energy and environmental policy with an emphasis on the politics of climate change, also an expert in the acceptability of carbon capture and storage and other technologies, so very pertinent to the topics today. So I'll hand over to you, David.
Great, thank you so much, Bethan, and it's a great pleasure to be here as the, I guess, token non-geoscientist here. And I wanted to speak about some of the results of some recent work that we've been doing here at Cambridge, and in particular a 8-country study which covers a whole range of topics, but amongst other things, we ask some interesting questions that I think will be quite relevant to this audience. So I have a fair number of slides go through, but I'll try and kind of start with the takeaways. The first is that it is, I think, notable, and it wasn't necessarily clear a year ago, but that, even in the midst of a global pandemic, the general public, whether that's in Britain or any number of other major countries, care about the environment and about climate change in particular, and are keen to take action. A second point is that with regard to communication and public understanding of the earth sciences in particular, I think I would characterize it as at best scattershot. And there are some areas where there's some persistent misunderstandings, which we'll see. In terms of that, who does the communications, many of the actors that are doing the communications actually are not well trusted, and that's something I'll come to. And then finally, in terms of the portfolio of options that we might have available to us to address the climate problem, those involving the geosciences tend to either have some pockets of resistance or large question marks and uncertainties there. So straight to our results, we did a survey, which actually with funding from a UKRI grant, and the lack of our ability to travel allowed us to actually increase our geographic scope. So we looked at 4 developed countries, Australia, Britain, the United States, and Japan, and 4 developing countries, South Africa, India, China, and Brazil. And we find that, when asked what are the top 3 most important issues facing your country at this time, and this was conducted in early 2021, the environment was, one of the top 3 or 4 issues that people listed pretty much across the board. And even when we asked what is the single most important issue facing your country at this time, it's notable that, some 5, 10, 15% of publics actually said that the environment was the single most important issue facing us even in the midst of a pandemic. On the question of whether climate change is a threat to your country, again, very strong majorities felt that it was quite a major threat. And notably, the skeptics, those who don't believe that it is a threat, we only find some 10, 12% in the US, some 8 or 9% in Australia, and relatively small numbers in other major economies. So how much do people know? So people care about the climate. They're sort of divided in how much attention they pay to these issues. Only 20, 30% might consider themselves knowledgeable about how energy is produced, delivered, and used. And then when we actually kind of try and ask some detailed questions as to whether people really understand the science, we find some mixed results. As I mentioned, there's some positive numbers. So people aren't completely confident, but many believe that we're currently in a warm period between ice ages. They're more convinced that every time we use coal, oil, or gas, we do contribute to climate change. They also generally seem to know, with some exceptions, that coal is produced from dead plants. On the other hand, there's some areas of maybe some failings in our educational training at primary and secondary schools. So actually a decent majority of people believe across most countries believe that dinosaurs were alive 1 million years ago. Even more relevant to climate policy, partly because I think of this dramatic image that we saw in the 80s of a ozone hole. Many people believe that climate change is caused by a hole in the Earth's atmosphere. They also don't necessarily know where, if we're talking about storing CO2, for example, or extracting oil and gas, Many people don't know the answer, but amongst those that do, the majority would believe that oil and gas reservoirs would typically be only 100 meters below the surface. And again, that might explain why they also have certain reactions to the idea of further oil and gas exploration or storing CO2. We also asked some questions with regard to their understanding of climate change and whether certain activities led to significant impacts on the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. And again, people knew that coal burning plants were responsible for increasing CO2. They were a bit more divided on nuclear power, and many of them believe that nuclear power actually significantly increases CO2 levels. On wind turbines, probably a question of framing. Some believe that it had no impact. Others believe that it actually decreased CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And in terms of some lessons in terms of the carbon cycle, people do seem to know that planting trees does have a negative impact on CO2 in the atmosphere. On questions of trust, even on university scientists, which are by our study kind of the most beloved or the most trusted, there are significant bastions of concern and numbers who, 10, 20% who don't trust university scientists. But that does quite well compared to other groups. Environmental groups, we see significant sources of distrust, and even more so for oil and gas companies, where we see very low levels of trust, the kind of the reddish orange, or national governments. Many of them, again, many of these will be the main actors advocating certain projects. And they compete with social media for the active distrust amongst many of our publics that we consulted. And then finally, I mentioned we asked about portfolios of options to address climate change. And here we see, some variation from country to country. So places like Australia weren't keen on direct air capture and enhanced weathering. The US wasn't keen on putting aerosols into the stratosphere. Wind energy and solar energy, overwhelmingly positive. Afforestation, overwhelmingly positive. And again, a divided public over nuclear energy and over pretty much anything to do with carbon capture and storage. And notably, the UK was most opposed to anything to do with coal and CCS. And maybe I'll just end this short talk with some questions that still need to be answered, both from our data that we're just starting to look into in more depth, but also more generally for this sort of audience. And so the first question is, well, what is the impact of the public being more educated with regard to these issues? How does that actually relate to their attitudes towards potential energy and climate solutions? Do we see any important differences, whether that's gender, age, or regional in many of these countries? Do more resource-dependent regions have different attitudes with regard to solutions? Would providing more information or better information change outcomes? And what explains why we seem to be doing well in our educational system on certain issues and certain facts and certain relationships, but not on others, and whether some of the new options that we see being advanced, and I would include CCS in that because of the low level of public awareness. How might they be framed and how might they be perceived by the public as well as key stakeholders? Thank you.
Thanks, David. Lots of questions, and communication has obviously been a bit of a theme this afternoon. So I think some reflections there on who should communicate, what should they communicate, and how should they communicate it. So I think that also leads really nicely into Mike's talk. So to introduce Mike, so Mike will be known to many of you as the Director of Science and Technology at the BGS, with degrees from Imperial and Sheffield. He runs the science programme at British Geological Survey, and this is the UK's National Geoscience and Data Centre, and he leads a team of over 500 scientists and technologists there. So, you know, one of the questions themes we've had today around communication, and the question is also, how do we work with government to develop the right policy in order to support and enable the energy transition? So over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Bethan. So I'm just going to give a sort of short interpretation of, I guess, what the government thinks about decarbonisation, whether that's sort of policy or what it has said in the past about decarbonisation. So the first thing to say really is that the contents are, what does government decarbonisation policy look like? What does the government seem to be saying about decarbonisation policy? How is the geoscience community responding, and how can we respond, and what the gaps might be in that effort? So the first thing to say really is it's really quite, there's a kind of blizzard of information and materials on government policy in terms of decarbonisation, and it's really quite bewildering. So you can see some of those snapshots there: the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, the Energy White Paper, the North Sea Transition Deal, which has been mentioned earlier, the Global Britain in a Competitive Age, which came out about 2 weeks ago, Industrial Decarbonisation Strategy, also the awards for the 9 industrial cluster projects. So it is a very complex landscape. But I actually think the most useful one is the net zero future, the Energy White Paper, which was published, I think, on the 23rd of December, just before Christmas. So a kind of wonderful gift for you to read over Christmas, which is what I did. But the Prime Minister's 10-point plan is something that came out earlier than that. And you can see it laid out here. And, you know, a first cursory reading shows that geoscience, you know, should have quite an important role here. So carbon capture and storage, obviously, greener buildings in terms of geothermal, certainly, net zero emission vehicles, certainly in terms of critical metals, nuclear power, obviously, because of the geological aspect of repository, offshore wind because of siting. So, for example, the geology of the seabed, and things like hydrogen too. So hydrogen as a storage, being able to store it as a gas, which will almost certainly involve geoscience. So, you know, on the face of it, you know, if we look at the 10-point plan, there's quite a lot of geology in there. But as I said, probably the best and most useful guide is the Powering Our Net Zero Future, the Energy White Paper, which just came out at the end of December. One of the interesting things about it, if you read it, I mean, it's quite long and there's an awful lot in there. I mean, it really does tell you about what's going on. But I think the clearest thing that I got, and other people might interpret this differently, was the government sees it as 3 challenges, really: industry and power, buildings and transport. And it really does see it fairly simply. And I think there's somewhat of a lesson in that for us as well, in the sense that probably being too technological or technocratic in our offerings to government, you know, talking about geothermal or talking about compressed air energy storage or all these other things, it might be more useful to talk in their language. So to actually cluster our expertise under industry and power, buildings and transport. But again, on the face of it, the geosciences can contribute. So for industry and power, there's obviously CCS, hydrogen, energy storage, turbine geotechnical, so in other words, the foundations for wind turbines, for example. Under buildings, there's geothermal, heat storage, coal mine energy. Under transport, there's obviously critical metals and the circular economy. But if you actually look at the white paper really carefully, what you'll find is that, yes, some aspects of what the geosciences can contribute are well known and understood by government. That's if we take the white paper as a guide. So for example, for CCS, it's very, very clear that CCS is a geoscience thing and it's really needed for industry and power. But for buildings, I would say that geothermal and heat storage and coal mine energy really doesn't appear much at all in the Energy White Paper. I would say that the government really doesn't see that as part of the solution. So I think we have a problem there. And in the critical metals circular economy area, thanks to people like Francis Wall, who spoke earlier on, it is rising, and it's clear that there is, a really important geoscience element to this circular economy, critical metals and transport area. But I think overall, we probably need to simplify our message a bit, to get our story heard, in the sense that the government sees it as those three challenges. So we should probably make our offering a bit simpler so that it addresses those challenges, so the government can see that. So that's the Energy White Paper. But as I was hinted at earlier, the problems with the Energy White Paper are that, so geothermal, for example, doesn't get a mention in the White Paper, not really. And it still isn't really licensed or regulated properly. And if you look at BGS's recent briefing paper, which we published, I think, a few years ago, which was on who owns geothermal heat, you can see there are some significant problems. We may think that we can solve some of the heating of the UK with geothermal, whether it be hot, dry rock or low enthalpy aquifer geothermal. But in fact, there are some real barriers with licensing and regulation, in the sense that heat isn't licensed in the UK and it isn't presently regulated properly. So people's investments aren't protected, and it would be difficult to see this happening. So the government has to step in to deal with that, and it's not really doing it. And another interesting one, again, these are my interpretations. There's a big section in the Energy White Paper about the Midlands as a UK centre for mass production of electric vehicle batteries. They're talking about $500 million for these gigafactories. But really, there's a big gap between what that is saying and what our geoscientists are saying about, say, cobalt and lithium, the things that earlier that Francis was saying, that really we have to connect with industry, with local industry, local government, local innovation, to link these ambitions to the resource implications. At the moment, there's a certain amount of government saying we're going to do all this, but haven't really thought about where these metals are going to come from. So I think there's a gap there. One interesting area is that local universities, for example, the Energy Research Accelerator, which is a multi-million-pound university consortium in the Midlands, is thinking about this quite nicely. And if we can link with the universities that are thinking about this, these local groups that are thinking about, for example, mass production of electric vehicles, we can probably connect in a bit better. So I think those are two challenges. Another really interesting thing that's emerging, and something that Bethan touched on, was essentially this offshore decarbonisation issue, which I think Oil and Gas Authority nicely articulated in a wonderful strategy that they've published, which shows how you might use the offshore infrastructure of the North Sea, how you might have gas to wire, hydrogen storage, CCS, and wind turbines all using the same space. And clearly there are challenges there, but it's clear that the government wants, and the OGA wants, the North Sea to be a net zero basin. They're using that phrase. They want to help that happen by having the North Sea transition deal and the industrial decarbonisation strategy alongside all this really interesting stuff about clusters. And the government is really putting its money where its mouth is, because these clusters are pretty well funded. They are being helped along by numerous research and other sorts of funding that are attempting to get over the market failure element. And of course, there's the UKRI awards of 171 million to the 9 UK decarbonisation projects. So a lot's happening in the offshore, and that's really a new thing, and I think an interesting, a really important opportunity for us. So what are we doing about it? Well, we have, and I was asked particularly to mention this, the Decarbonisation Working Group, which I'm the chair of, which is another Geological Society group. We've already produced careers and engagement posters on carbon capture and storage, materials for the energy transition, for geothermal energy, for energy storage. You can see the group operating in this area. We produced a very nice policy influencer and explainer on the role of geoscience in decarbonisation. And about 2 days ago, we published a geoscience on the hydrogen economy, policy influencer and explainer. And also we are working on focused Chatham House style workshops. So we had one recently with the Cabinet Office on critical metals. So these are things that we are attempting to do to get closer to government, to bridge that gap, to make sure that government does realise what we can offer. Another element is the fantastic geoenergy observatories that we've got. Earlier on, it was mentioned that we have the UK Geo-Energy Observatories in Glasgow, and we'll shortly have them in Cheshire as well, which looks at essentially that last stage of getting all our modeling and our lab scale work up to a standard where it actually makes real practical sense. And it's a really important jump. We examined that at a great conference a few months ago, which I led in convening the role of subsurface research labs in delivering net zero. And they're very important because they raise the profile of geoenergy research. And then very important because the government notices, and also government says, wow, they can actually do that. That really works. So, you know, that's again very helpful. And something that's really interesting, I think, is the NERC's ambition through BGS to scope a new subsurface CO2 storage laboratories, which I think can be really exciting. So that's something that was announced recently as well. So that's a really big plus point. So in conclusion, what I would say is the policy landscape, what government says about decarbonisation is very complex. Perhaps the Energy White Paper is the best guide to read. I think the government sees decarbonisation as challenges really in three areas: industry and power, buildings and transport. And we'd be wise to adapt our messages to this view, I think. I think we need to get geothermal more clearly on the map. And this is my interpretation. Other people may see this differently. I also think that although we're working well with the critical metals area, I think this gap between the government's ambitions to mass produce electric cars and other aspects of critical metals, we probably need to connect it to the resources a bit better. There's also this very strong offshore theme developing with multiple geoscience opportunities. So again, I think it'd be fantastic in a few years. We could be working in hydrogen storage in the deep North Sea, just as well as we could be dealing with CCS in the deep parts of the subsurface in the North Sea. Things like the GSL decarbonisation working group is influencing papers, organising workshops. We're trying to get this thing moving. And there's also this great value in geoenergy test sites, because that's where it really shows that we can do research at scale, so that the government and industry and the public can see we can really do these things. And again, that's part of public engagement. So I'll stop there and happy to answer questions when the time comes. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. And you already make a recommendation following on from Jen's point about when we're communicating with the government, we need to probably adapt to their framework of thought in order to have the most impact. So yeah, that's lining up. So finally, I'd like to introduce Richard Norris, Dr. Richard Norris. So he's got more than 30 years experience in the energy sector, most recently as a consulting partner at Helios Investment Partners, where he co-managed $500 million of investments. And he's worked globally in technical and management roles across the energy industry. So Richard's going to talk to us now on the side of economics. So the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And I look forward to a very interesting presentation from Richard. So over to you.
Sorry, I'm just going to share my screen if I get this right. Okay, is that showing up okay for you?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, thank you. If we had an hour or two, or maybe half a day or a short course, I could probably get into a lot of details on this, but we've only got about 10 minutes. So I'm going to make a lot of generalizations and some shortcuts, and we can discuss these in the Q&A. So the first generalization is that energy and the economy are the same thing. There are clear correlations between GDP and energy demand, as well as these two variables being correlated with population growth. And what's very clear about the increase shown in this graph is that the vast amount of wealth that's been created in the world has been done at a time when we have used vastly more energy. And this corresponds, of course, to what's known as the Industrial Revolution and subsequently the Technological Revolution. Sorry, I've got a slight technical issue there. Yeah. What has happened during that period is that every human development index has improved. The human condition has improved despite the fact that the population has increased more than 7-fold. The number of people living in poverty, dying in childhood, dying from natural disasters and so on, all of these have improved. And a leading thinker in the area, Václav Smil, has said that to discuss energy in the economy is tautology. And what he means by that is that energy is the economy. And I'll go one step further and say that cheap energy, because cheap energy is what we've had through the Industrial Revolution, cheap energy is the engine of development. So what's happened in recent years is that we've ended up with what Hans Rosling would describe as the single focus perspective. And within the framework of the energy trilemma, energy sustainability or the environmental impact of energy has become the single focus. And people have forgotten about or become blind to the other two branches. One of which is that we need our energy supply to be secure, that is always on, 24/7, 365. And we need our energy to be affordable. And this is something that's not taken into account very well in modern economics, indeed, if at all. And I think the reason for that is simply because energy has always been affordable and available. And the assumption is that it will always continue to be so. Now, this graph does not show the oil price. This graph shows the amount the world spends on oil as a percentage of GDP. This comes from an article in the FT. In other words, when the world is spending more than 5% of global GDP on oil, it triggers recessions. And recessions means essentially that people get poorer. Now, this is a very complex idea, and you could ask yourself, why does something that only represents 5% of GDP have such a major impact? Well, the answer is that we need oil, and by proxy, gas and coal and nuclear power and other forms of energy, as inputs to absolutely everything, because the economy is simply the transformation of stuff. And from a thermodynamics point of view, transformations require energy. And this leads us to the idea of embodied energy. Everything that we have, everything we touch, and indeed, whether it's goods or services, has an embodied energy. So when the cost of energy goes up, it's not just that it costs you slightly more to put fuel in your car, whether it's molecules or electrons, or whether your electricity or gas bill goes up for heating your home. No, the price of absolutely everything goes up because of the mechanization that we have in our industrial society. Everything from food to medicines to smartphones will go up in price if the cost of energy goes up. So when thinking about the energy transition, the cost question comes up in two different ways. The first one is that either renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuels. Now, if that were the case in an absolute sense, it would be a complete no-brainer and we would be running off into the sunlit uplands. The other thing we hear quite often, and I've heard this said on multiple occasions, is that the cost of renewable energy is actually not important because the cost of not transitioning is so unimaginably high. Now, again, this is the subject for perhaps an entire separate discussion, but there are some nuances, and one of those nuances is that it probably can't be both of these things. So when we're talking about the unimaginably high cost of doing nothing, we hear of studies which say that fossil fuels have $5.2 or $5.3 trillion of subsidies, and a more recent one claiming that the hidden cost of energy and transport adds up to $25 trillion. Now that's a very big number. That's something like 30% of global GDP. But really what they're talking about is not subsidies and tax breaks, but actually negative externalities, which is absolutely every kind of societal bad that can be ascribed to fossil fuels. And this includes not just the obvious effects of air pollution, but the modeled effects of climate change and assumptions around the cost of traffic congestion and indeed stress on the health service caused by traffic accidents, as if these would suddenly go away because cars become electric. So I put this here in a mathematical notation. It's 1 minus the kitchen sink because these negative externalities have been broadened to include everything but the kitchen sink. On the other hand, and according to the professor who authored the study, which referred to $25 trillion, these energy systems do have positive externalities. And he said they create jobs. So whilst the negative externalities is a shockingly broad basket, the positive externalities is a shockingly narrow definition. Energy systems don't have positive impacts because they create jobs. Energy systems have a positive externality because cheap energy creates the economy. And what this does, as we saw earlier, is it allows development. It allows countries to get richer, fewer people to be poorer, for people to be less subject to the randomness of nature. So the obvious conclusion is, well, can't we have all of the good, the development, the growth, and so on without the bad? And to do that, the answer is we simply swap out fossil fuels with clean renewables and we continue into this utopian future. Well, we're sort of trying this, and I would say the initial results are not particularly promising. Germany is the first major economy to phase out nuclear, and because they've noticed that in doing so, they've actually increased their greenhouse gas emissions, they've decided to phase out coal as well. The problem is that if there is no coal and no nuclear, what is the plan B? And the answer is, sadly, they don't really have one. Although when pushed, the plan B for Germany is that they will depend more on their neighbours for power as they phase out coal and nuclear. And the problem with that is that everybody is going to be doing the same thing. The UK imports over 10% of its electricity from Europe. Belgium is shutting down 7 nuclear power stations. The Netherlands has relied on gas for the last 50 or 60 years, and that has now come to an end. So they're actually thinking of building a nuclear reactor. And what this says is that everybody's going to be relying on the French. But if you talk to the French, they're very concerned they don't actually have enough electricity for their own needs. So as an example, this is the about 2 weeks ago, the 31st of March. If you take out coal and nuclear from the German electricity supply, you have a problem, because wind and solar were doing absolutely nothing that day. So the question is, where will the electricity come from? And the answer is, you're going to have a lot more gas. And at the same time, you have to pray that electricity storage solutions materialize on a massive scale. So as a consequence of the energy transition, energy security is going to decrease for Germany and indeed for the whole of Europe as we increase our reliance on Russian gas. The cost of the system is going to increase because you need a dual system. You need to have renewable energy for when it works, but you need to have a huge battery capacity, maybe a hydrogen economy, and almost certainly a large amount of standby gas-fired power. Building a dual system, of course, is more cost than having a simple system. Already the costs of electricity in Germany have increased significantly. They're something like 70% more expensive than in France, to the extent that last year the additional costs were no longer attributed directly to the energy bills as a green surcharge, which is what's shown here, but 28 billion euros worth was spread across general taxation to hide the fact that this cost was caused by the energy transition. And from the environmental point of view, well, you may well be reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, but certainly not completely. Now, of course, if the objective was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that was really what we were concerned about, well, Germany should do like France. France has consistently had some of the lowest greenhouse gas emissions of any country per capita for the last 50 years. Why? Well, because in the 1980s, they elected to go all in on nuclear. So this comes back to the notion that cost doesn't matter. But of course, costs do matter. People don't generally think of energy as an input to the economy. But when we see that the average US wage in real terms has the same purchasing power as it did 40 years ago, you have to scratch your head and ask yourself why. In the US, household incomes have decreased, and of course they've decreased more for the poorer sections of society, and this trend is reflected across most OECD countries. Now, if this is true, and if this continues, we're going to see a lot more of this, where people worry about what the French call pouvoir d'achat, their purchasing power. They say things like, we're not worried about the end of the century, we're worried about making it to the end of the month. So I think the political landscape is at the moment very aligned with the decarbonisation agenda, but it is going to run up against some societal issues as costs increase. So to try and summarize a very complex set of ideas in a very short period of time, when we think about the energy supply and the energy trilemma, if we think about energy security, we have a system that's worked very well using fossil fuels and nuclear power. And to replicate or indeed replace it, we will need to use renewable energy and have a large amount of storage and or backup. When we think about the environmental impact, well, fossil fuels plus their externalities have got to be matched by renewable energy with storage and backup, plus some understanding of the fact that there are actually negative externalities around the renewable energy space as well. And then the question of cost, and this is the one that's really problematic, because in any case that I can imagine, if we continue with fossil fuels, there's going to become a scarcity issue, particularly around oil, and that is likely to push the cost up. Equally, as we transition carbon capture and storage and or carbon taxes, well, they're going to push the cost base up as well. If we progress with renewables, there's a very high cost associated with storage and backup, and to ensure that we have the security of supply that we're used to. So in almost any scenario looking forward, it's very hard to imagine that the cost of energy is not going to increase and all the consequences that come with that. That is, unless of course we believe in utopia, which ironically is a term that was defined almost as a definition of a place that does not exist. And with that happy thought, I shall stop this and turn us over to Q&A, I think.
Thanks very much, Richard. Great talk and lots of food for thought there. So there's been quite a lot of relevant questions throughout the afternoon already. So I'm going to kind of go back to a couple of questions that were asked actually in the earlier sessions. So first of all, there was a question from Andrew Botsford about how will the world fund the energy transition? And I particularly wanted to zero in on the timescales required. So obviously we've seen in the UK quite some progress on climate change legislation, and we've referred to the policies. Mike gave a great overview, but how do we address the timing issue? So maybe I can put that to David first, and then let the others build on that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that is related to some of Richard's points as well, and I think what Mike did a good job of outlining was, some of the overarching policies that have been developed. I think the real challenge will be that it's not enough to have, some hundreds of millions to get these, say industrial clusters started. It will require some billions to actually see them come to fruition. And that then does start to get people in Treasury thinking about it, and also it does get to people's pocketbooks. I do think that actually is an interesting example because it doesn't just kind of impose the cost generically or think about the benefits generically, but does actually says something about place. And so it's not an accident, I think, that Hull City Council is leading one of the clusters, Teesside Authority is leading another. And I think that arguably can have some, at least go some way to kind of bridging some of these problems. It's very easy. It's easy enough to set these 2050 ambitions, but understandably, politicians, policymakers, sort of blanch at the idea of imposing, having the tens of billions that will really be needed to accomplish this transition. So if it can provide some tangible benefits, I think that would be quite important. On nuclear, for example, the local communities, people might, overall in the UK might not care about nuclear, but in local communities that have nuclear power plants, there is a sense that this provides local benefits.
Thanks, David. Mike, maybe you want to build on that as well. Yeah.
I mean, how do we pay for the energy transition is a great question. I think actually the UK is doing a good job with the clusters. They're recognizing that there are certain areas where the conditions are right. It's a bit like the old industrial revolution, where there were certain areas where the conditions were right to build factories because you had coal, blah, blah, blah. What we have now is a different set of geological factors that influence where clusters will work and where they won't work, including CCS, hydrogen storage, etc. I think the government is doing this. It's realizing that there's certain industries in ecologies that work together well, and which would, with an injection of cash, just get over that market failure, just get over that little bump, that activation energy that gets them going from being people that think about energy transition, about decarbonization of refineries or cement factories, and actually do it. So I think that's a model, and eventually clusters elsewhere in the world will do the same for industrial decarbonization. So in Australia and the United States, and they are doing it already. It's a good model to begin with. But I think what's interesting is how the developing world would do that. And in a way, most of the energy growth is going to be in the developing world in the next 50 years. So it kind of doesn't matter what we do so much as what East Africa does as it begins to develop, and Southeast Asia. And, if they develop, in a decarbonization path that is sustainable, then everything's fine. But if they choose to use fossil fuels like we did, it will be rather different. So I think I'm pretty positive about it, particularly in the UK, because I think we're probably doing the right thing. And the other thing, of course, is renewables are getting cheaper. And in many places, renewables are much cheaper than fossil fuels. So it's happening anyway.
Thanks, Mike. Richard, anything you want to add on that topic before we take the next question on the issue of timing and speed?
Yeah, I'm pretty well known as being a bit of a miserable person, but I'm nowhere near as optimistic. I think that there are a lot of scenario planning for how we get to net zero in 2050. And I think when you put them on an appropriate scale, they all look like extreme wishful thinking. There are so many things that have to line up for these things to happen. And perhaps one of the key things is that you have to get away from the fact that it's not a linear process. You have low-hanging fruit. There are some very easy things to decarbonize. Taking coal out of the UK electricity system was a very easy win. That does not translate to what happens as you get further along the curve. And actually, if I may, I'd just like to share a slide that I didn't have time for. But I think it's a really important thing that this was a study that was done in the Netherlands, and it's called the carbon cost curve. And it's really just trying to look at what it would take to get to net zero, and not as a 10-point plan with nice graphics and arm waving, but actually saying at every step, what would we do and what would it cost? And what it tells me is that most of the things that would be done, will be more expensive because everything above the line requires a subsidy. Most of it requires technology that doesn't exist yet, or certainly doesn't exist at scale. And the stuff on the extreme right-hand end, where we have no idea what the technology is and we don't know what the cost is, that last 10 or 15%, we don't even know how to do it. So, it's scenario planning when you actually have to go away from just making nice presentations and actually think about what you do at every step. It suddenly looks a whole lot harder.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Indeed, the actual doing of this is important. Right, there you go, appropriate cat infection. Right, the other question I wanted to pick up was about, I'd be interested in people's views on the, building on a question from Barney Brennan about encouraging collaboration. So what role do we see for policy and regulation to, encourage that collaboration between businesses and sectors in order to deliver on the energy transition? Any takers for jumping in on that question, David?
I mean, just to reemphasize the point about the clusters. I mean, I think they are actually an unusually good example of which we don't have actually all that many of an effort to try and actually catalyze some of that collaboration, some of that engagement. And frankly, it doesn't take a huge amount of money. So the industrial decarbonization challenge is I think something that's a couple of £100 million. But what it has done is it's gotten a number of large firms, including your own Bethan, and as well as local authorities who are in many ways quite weak in the UK compared to their counterparts in kind of federal states like in the US or Canada or Germany. So I think that there are ways of doing that. That still is kind of if you want, the early bit, but it's actually quite challenging to do that. So I think that isn't a terrible example to look to.
Yeah, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, Richard's right in the sense that these industrial decarbonisation, there is a particular sector of the economy that we're decarbonising, and the clusters are a good way of doing it. There are whole other areas which are more difficult to do, as he rightly points out, but it is a good way of doing it. And one thing we also realise is that many of the companies that are involved in the clusters, these ecologies of like-minded industries, actually want to do it because they realise that as this is the way to go, and here's a government which is offering, a way to do it. So, the big refineries, the big cement factories, the fertilizer factories know that they're going to have to decarbonize sometime. They're going to have to develop a business model that works. And here's a government and a cluster and a kind of infrastructure to help them do that. So, and the second thing I would just briefly say is that although I hate to mention shale gas, if you go back, many decades, there was a time when the oil price went very high in the United States, and the US began to really worry about getting oil and gas from somewhere else. And so they invested in it in a public sector sort of way. They spent loads of money on shale gas, and nothing really happened for a couple of decades, but then suddenly it began to happen. And, we can spend money sensibly. You could argue that isn't a sensible way of money because it's fossil fuels, but the principle is the same, that, you know, government money can be spent sensibly on thinking about, you know, problems and helping the private sector to take them on. So I think there's a real role in the public sector helping, and one example is things like test sites. So, you know, we don't have the kind of money to do that. Government does, but the CO2 test site is an example that we're developing. The UK GEOS observatories are also an example of where public money could be spent well in order to catalyze this change.
Thank you, Mike. So I think, just conscious of time, I think we need to head now into the wrap-up session, session 5. So I'm going to hand over to Jen, who will lead us through the final panel and wrap up. Over to you, Jen.
Brilliant. Thanks, Bethan, and thanks for that really lively session just then. So yeah, we're now into session 5, the final half hour of the day, in which we've got Bulleid and Sir Andrew Mackenzie will be back in discussion, picking up on the key themes from the day, highlighting topics that haven't been covered thus far. I've been taking some of the comments and questions from the Q&A as well to build that in. And we're just going to be asking Ros and Andrew to offer their thoughts more generally about how the geosciences contributes to the energy transition. Now, Bulleid is the head of policy at Green Alliance, an independent think tank and charity focused on ambitious leadership for the environment. Green Alliance's current areas of focus include decarbonisation of key sectors like heating and transport, clean growth and management of the natural environment, all topics that we've heard about this afternoon. And it's really brilliant that Ros is here to provide her thoughts on the perspectives and challenges shared today around the energy transition. Now, those of you who've been here since the start of today's event have had the pleasure of hearing Sir Andrew Mackenzie's opening perspectives on earth science and the energy transition. Andrew, for those who weren't here, Andrew is a leading figure in the energy and mining industries, fellow of the Royal Society and truly applied earth scientist, and a fantastic storyteller as well, as we found from the opening talk. So thanks, Ros and Andrew, for joining this. It's quite cosy discussion panel. There's just the 3 of us, 25 minutes, some questions from me, and possibly also time to, yeah, as I say, kind of mine some of those questions that sees upon from the Q&A throughout the afternoon. Just to start, I wanted to ask Andrew, I'll start with Ros, Andrew and then Ros, to share your reflections on what you've heard this afternoon and what stood out for you.
Or do I go first?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, I want to jump in. Well, look, I think most of what I heard was a good example of some of the things I was saying in my opening remarks. There's an awful lot of things for geologists to do. I did want to just add one sense of perspective. I mean, I think it's very important that we as earth scientists should tell the world that we know the earth. And by knowing the earth, that we don't see a particular constraint on all these additional metals that are required. And I think Francis put it across quite well. I mean, there's a sort of a little bit of a panic that some of this stuff is not available. And of course, there are reasons as to why China supplies an awful lot, but they're not geologically based. They're just based on the way in which those economies have developed, and they've chosen to produce things reasonably cheaply, and the world has relied on them at a point when they didn't think they were critical. But you know, one of the things I'm fond of saying, that when you know the earth, you realize that nothing is running out. It's just a bit of geology that's required to discover things and to develop things elsewhere. But I'm quite keen to repeat one of the things I've said. I'm not a great fan of finding lots of little mines everywhere, and particularly say that Britain has to have its own supply of all these critical metals. I hope that geopolitics are not going to be so bad that that's going to be required, because the impact on the world of lots of small mines, rather than having a smaller number of larger mines in the right places, would be quite negative for the environment, and would actually be negative for the carbon footprint of those mining activities. But I would say, and Stuart mentioned it, that when you take the view that I do, that nothing is running out, and in fact an awful lot of things it can probably be found in the spoil heaps of mines that have already been worked, like cobalt, for example, around nickel mines, then you could put a stop to some of the exaggerated talk about us having to go into the deep sea or even into the asteroid belt to get those metals. I mean, whenever there was an announcement like that, when I was running BHP, I always got somebody would send me an email saying I would like to apply for the head of deep sea or the head of asteroid mining, to which I would reply, there is no vacancy, because we think we can get all those metals much more cheaply and much more greenly, if you like, by just consolidating and expanding our existing mines. So I think that was the thing that I wanted to get across. But the other thing I wanted to say is that the move, if you like, as a big employer from oil and gas to mining is not that significant, in the sense that the kind of employment opportunities that oil and gas provided for geologists are far greater and were far greater than will come through in mining. And I think a couple of the speakers gave some of the reasons why. A lot of the metals that we mine are actually infinitely recyclable, and so that they will be much more part, if you like, of the circular economy. Not entirely, and there are trade-offs here. I mean, at the margin, some circularity has actually got a larger carbon footprint than actually just going back and starting from scratch. But nonetheless, they will substantially reduce the demand. So we're not going to find that if you like, the big employer for geoscientists in the future will move from oil and gas to mining, and we shouldn't expect that. Which is why the other points I made in my introduction, that we have to think about the geological contribution much more widely, and some things were mentioned, like geothermal, that I didn't cover, if we're going to, I think, give ourselves a certain critical mass as a subject to do all the things that I spoke about in my talk. So I think that was the main thing I would say, but I thought it led on quite well, but we also then need to give everything a bit of a sense of perspective.
Thanks, Andrew. So Roz, would you like to offer your thoughts? What stood out to you?
Thank you. Yes, and thanks to me as well for welcoming a non-geologist into your midst. And apologies if I've massively misinterpreted anything from that perspective. But no, it's really interesting. I was particularly struck by Francis and others said around resource efficiency. I think that really resonates with me, and we know that extracting and processing resources is causing 90% of global biodiversity loss and water stress and half of greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And that kind of link between resource use and climate change isn't always, I don't think, understood and kind of fully appreciated by policymakers. Certainly the 10-point plan, which has a lot of good stuff in it too, that was an element that we really missed, and think government hasn't fully grasped, and it doesn't feel, I think it's to some extent the kind of link up in the UK at least between government areas of government policy making. So resource efficiency and waste management is DEFRA's responsibility, and climate change sits with BEIS. And I think sometimes those kind of interlinkages aren't as strong as they could be. We see some other countries kind of more deliberately linking aspects of their climate policy, for instance, the kind of carbon requirements for new buildings, linking resource requirements so that you kind of incentivizing people to reuse materials and look for lower carbon ones in constructing buildings, whereas the UK kind of hasn't quite got to that link up between the circular economy and climate yet. I mean, there are some positive signs on that front. So the Environment Bill has a proposal to have a target on resource productivity, but that's sort of GDP linked, so you could still increase resource use if your GDP goes up. And there are policies to target individual products and good words about a circular economy, but there's not that really kind of consistent timeline that could get us there, and feels a bit whack-a-mole, kind of addressing plastic straws and other products one at a time. So we want a really comprehensive sort of link up between policy making in those two areas, and that kind of, yeah, it's a bit cheesy, but I feel like resource efficiency is the kind of missing UK climate policy from our perspective. And there's obviously a huge role kind of in kind of coordinating and managing and being involved in those discussions and ensuring that resource stewardship, as was discussed earlier, goes kind of beyond extraction, ensuring that materials are in a position to be kind of reused and put to best effect later. Just, I mean, on another point that's sort of really struck me as a non-specialist in this area was, and I thought was interesting, was the kind of the points that you made actually about the kind of different uses to which the earth can be put, the ground under our feet, and making sure that's really coordinated and we make the best use of that. And I thought that was really interesting, and a good kind of challenge. We've not always shown that coordination, and noticed that made the most of that coordination in other areas, notably, I mean, the atmosphere and how we use that. as a sink for our emissions. And I think a more coordinated approach on that front sounds really sensible.
Okay, brilliant. So you've both actually picked up on slightly different things, as we hoped and expected, but also the kind of theme as well about this kind of connected up thinking. Particularly, I think, Andrew, you mentioned like not just thinking, like thinking also beyond carbon footprint, and that's that kind of bigger picture. So I wonder actually, and I wanted to create space for this. I wondered if you have noticed anything that hasn't been said today that is notably missing that you actually think needs to be on the table. So because I started with you last time, Andrew, first, I'm going to invite Ros to go first and then come back to you, Andrew.
Well, so not missing. I've seen some comments in the chat, and there's been discussion about the kind of role of the oil and gas industry. But I think, and speaking kind of as someone that spends a lot of time talking to environmentalists, we're kind of in quite a pragmatic position as a think tank, but we also spend a lot of time kind of convening environment sector. And I think there is definitely some sort of challenges and some questions to be answered on that front, in the sense that, I mean, UN studies, for instance, show that if governments to exploit all of the fossil fuels they're planning to exploit, that would take us well beyond the 2 degrees C pathway for global warming that is committed to in the Paris Agreement. So there's clearly a challenge there in kind of how we match each individual country's desires on these fronts and needs with the kind of global greater good. And that raises a question about which countries might decide not to exploit reserves, and how that might be done. And we have seen countries, Denmark, another example, that's kind of stepped away. The North Sea transition deal doesn't do that. And there are technological kind of options. There's hydrogen and CCUS as well, which maybe could mean that you could carry on exploiting reserves and mitigate the impacts for the climate to some degree. We are a little bit cautious about making sure those are used in the most effective way possible, and that they are not kind of, there's a kind of risk that they are used as a get out of jail free card, and people don't reduce emissions first, and you end up kind of consuming more energy as a society because you're using those options, or you're using those resources in the wrong place. So can definitely see a role for hydrogen, for instance, in industry. I would personally be a little bit concerned about using hydrogen in heating in homes and kind of locking ourselves into that route by, for instance, blending into the grid. So I think there's some kind of conversations to be had about the role of oil and gas and kind of the role of those technologies relating to it that could be really valuable, but kind of need to be used appropriately. And those discussions are kind of quite nascent, but it feels like there's a really something kind of difficult but worth discussing there. I think the slightly other uncomfortable point is around the messaging and where things come from. And I think for certain parts of the environment sector, and this is kind of touching what David said, but I think having kind of hydrogen and CCUS messages kind of sold as an oil and gas industry solution could be challenging. And I think this is something to be think about in terms of how the value of those technologies, where they're needed, is kind of best put forward, and who puts those messages forward as well. So yeah, apologies for sometimes kind of if I've prodded anyone in kind of uncomfortable places there, but just thought it was worth mentioning. Those are the sort of things that popped into my head.
That's great, and I think the part of this event series is to talk about these difficult and uncomfortable questions. And I think there's a movement within the geoscience that actually, so Andrew's talk at the very beginning was trying to talk about restoring pride and the reason for that pride. And there's quite a role in understanding that pride in delivering that future, and it has sort of sat quite uncomfortably with geoscientists. So we're quite comfortable with uncomfortableness, Ross. So Andrew, is there anything that you'd like to come back on, either on that we haven't talked about today, or anything that was raised just then?
Well, I think there's a few things I would like to sort of highlight. I think, and Mike said it a bit about, that this is a challenge that really, whilst it's important that Northwest Europe and Britain leads by example, the problem is not going to be solved here. The problem is going to be solved by the rapidly industrializing Asia, where the ratio is about 100 to 1. If you think about 5 billion people soon to be living in Asia, relative to the whatever it is, 65 million people living in the UK, and having a lot of debate about what happens in the UK is great about creating an example, and we have to, of course, put our own house in order. It's very important to recognize that this is going to be driven by systems and customers and governments that are not here. And thinking about that and thinking about how we influence that is to me very important. I think I would come back a little bit on what Rosa said, and she was being quite polite. But of course, it's always this challenge for me, and I would say that, wouldn't I, because of my pedigree, to think that because that we have produced fossil fuels in the past, somehow our contributions are not welcome as part of the next phase of energy transition. And you know, I understand some of the reticence around that, but many of the skills of the people on this call who previously have been generated by the search for oil and gas are quite critical. And as I was trying to point out my initial remarks as to how we're actually going to go about this. And so I think in the right way, if we can see the right kinds of oil and gas companies who say, we recognize that you enjoy many benefits from the fossil fuel industry that we've created, that we want you to continue to have, but we are aiming for you to have them without the carbon, then that, I think, ought to, in some eyes at least, give us a seat at the table, not the only seat at the table, as to how we can create that transition. And I think in all of that, in talking about resource efficiency, we have to be very clear about what we mean by resource efficiency, because the actual extraction of oil and gas, and far even more so in mining, is quite a small part of the total footprint. I mean, I always remember when I started in BHP, it's easier for me to talk about this right now, which is why we moved all of our thinking towards scope 3, was that actually the carbon footprint of mining was like a 30th of the carbon footprint of the consumption of mining products. And that might have been a little unfair because we didn't allow for a lot of recycling that is possible with metals. And in oil and gas, it's more like 10 to 1. And so if we don't actually get the users of the resources acting a lot more efficiently, which is the sense of being able to consume those resources in a way that doesn't produce carbon, then simply worrying about the pure resource efficiency in itself will not have a big impact. The other thing isn't related to this, but in relation to my other comment, I do think how we communicate as geoscientists and how we talk about geoscientists, we have a long way to go to create the appeal and the attraction of this science in a way that draws people towards us who haven't had a geoscience training. And I think, you know, right to how we produce geology in guidebooks or geology on signs when we go to places of natural beauty, I often feel they're written for geologists who are fascinated by some sort of arcane piece of stratigraphy in which part of the Upper Oxfordian we're dealing with, rather than for somebody who wants to just be awed by the fact that where they're standing used to be on the equator, and you know, and that mountain in front of them was caused by some form of upwelling from the mantle. So I think there's a lot we have to do there, and that is probably not completely unrelated at making sure that we're part of the whole firmament of the discussion as to how we get to net zero by 2050 or sooner if possible.
Yeah, I really agree. And actually, I did want to come back to, I'm going to park that and go over to Ross, but I would quite like to come back to that, Andrew. And actually, I'm a sucker for information boards. I'm the kind of person that sees, even if it's got nothing actually on it, because it's so old, it's got graffitied, I will gravitate towards it. But I also appreciate that that's only one way of communicating. And we're not that good at communicating in other ways, and certainly not necessarily the written forms that exist at some of these interesting sites. But Ross, I just wanted to invite you to respond to maybe to some of Andrew's comments just then.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I completely appreciate what Andrew's saying as well about the kind of legacy of skills and the important role that the oil and gas industry has played. So but I think there is there's a historical sort of perhaps a bit of a lack of trust around the kind of time it took some parts of the sector to kind of respond to climate change. And I think there's a danger, and this is certainly not just the sector by any means, but there's a bit of a danger about the kind of the benefits of hydrogen as opposed to kind of other things that can be done as well, like energy efficiency being overhyped, or not overhyped, but it being seen as a kind of panacea, and kind of a lot of lobbying being done very actively at once by kind of big players, which I think can just mean, it's perhaps a bit of a parochial pointer at environmental movement, but it can feel a little overwhelming and a little slick. And I think that's just the sort of, that's the level at which that happens. But I don't think, and certainly for kind of all the workers in the sector in the UK and elsewhere, that, I mean, that's not to write off the role of the sector, but in the slightest, I think it's just a kind of a bit of awareness about perhaps kind of how some of these things are communicated and the role in the coordination and communication. But I mean, I don't think I'm a million miles from where you are actually, really. I'm just sort of warning about kind of how it could come across if not managed correctly, I guess. Just on the resource efficiency, absolutely, again, really agree. Like when I talk about resource efficiency, I mean the kind of how people are using products as well, and how long they're in circulation for, whether we can kind of move to more rental services, all those things. I mean, that's all huge part. It's kind of better resource efficiency within society, moving away from a kind of disposable society to one where people really value the materials in their products. And again, that's somewhere where actually that kind of communication, that better understanding of the role of geologists and the kind of extractive industries could be really valuable. If people really pictured kind of when they were using something, the effort that had gone in and the resources that had gone into its construction, every element of it, I wonder if they would treat it differently as well. So, you know, just your washing machine, for instance, it's pretty bog standard. There's a whole range of different materials in there, and I find it fascinating actually when you kind of even understand the manufacturing processes involved, let alone the kind of extractive processes right at the start of the supply chain. So I think a lot of that could actually be helped by kind of communications. And yeah, we can come back to the boards and things, but I mean, I think that kind of power of awe and things is something not to be overlooked. Actually, I think there's engaging people on a level where it's kind of more in the level of education rather than kind of, more on the level of entertainment rather than kind of seeing a deficit, as Jen was saying about kind of good science communication. I think it's something could be really useful and really empowering there. And one of the reasons I was kind of keen to be part of this conversation actually is because I haven't seen the kind of role and hadn't thought about the sector particularly as a kind of and people with this kind of specialism as through that lens, the energy transition through that lens. And I think kind of there's definitely some useful and interesting and hopefully kind of inspiring conversations that you guys could have actually.
Yeah, and that's really about kind of capturing hearts and minds and inspiring and efficacy to make changes for ourselves and to drive change, and it links into a whole other thing. So there's a question I do want to ask about industry, but I'm going to ping that back in a second. I'm cognizant of time, but just because communications come out of those 2 points, do you have any thoughts or views about how do we tackle this? And there's been quite a lot of conversation in the Q&A around questions, discussions around the decrease in availability of geoscience in schools, which has implications for kind of higher education sectors, and also implications for the geoscience workforce for net zero, and broader around kind of engagement in geological heritage and landscape that you've both now spoken really passionately about. So what can we do? Help.
I mean, to be honest, I mean, I'm sort of, Jen, in a sort of, help mode as well, because I do worry that with the absence of the big employment and funding, and of course it's not going to go away, but it's not going to grow in the way it was, and it's more likely to shrink than remain constant, of the oil and gas business, that we will run the risk of the subject being marginalized and it being a branch of something else and used when it's appropriate, and that of course will destroy our ability in many ways to provide a lot of those communications, and that's why I said the things up front, because I say it's not going to be helped by just saying we're all going to be miners now instead of oil and gas people. Yeah, I mean, I want to be optimistic, and because I do think we have a case to make, but we have a hell of a fight as well, because I think the factors are conspiring towards reducing the amount of which geology is taught. I mean, in schools, it's a difficult one. That I mean, I've probably changed my mind there. I mean, when I was a budding geoscientist, I thought it was quite a good idea, or a geologist, I thought it was quite a good idea that I couldn't do it at school, because I ended up with decent maths, physics and chemistry that you really need to be a proper practicing career geologist, in my view. But I'm much more interested now in geology as something that is a broadener of minds in the way I talked about. And probably for that to happen, it does need to be taught more at a lower level, and for people to see it in the same way that they want to understand the nature around them, they want to understand the rocks they sit on, they want to understand their planet, the scarcity or non-scarcity, but at least the preciousness of winning resources. And it has to therefore become more part of what the Americans would call a liberal arts education, something probably my younger self would have resisted, because I would have felt we would have ended up with a bunch of people who couldn't actually be put to work as a mining engineer. But I think we have to realize that that's not where the employment will lie in the future. And actually a lot of people are drawn to geology because they are naturalists. They like the natural world. They like getting out in the open, they like field work. And therefore they are the natural, if you like, if they can forget where their money is coming from, they are the natural sort of bedfellows of environmentalists. Many of us are environmentalists because of that. We get into it because of our love of nature. And it's somehow tapping into that visceral part of the subject and moving it away, from it previously being there mainly as an opportunity to get a job in an oil company.
I will just quickly, this is definitely not my expert area, but I think having and speaking from very kind of just very anecdotal, but my having seen a class of 8-year-olds doing a sort of short topic on geology, which actually isn't something that I ever looked at that age, and being really enthused and being told a lot on school runs how exciting it was and interesting. Just maybe there is something to be said for talking to people at a very young age, and as Andrew says, kind of tapping into that sort of love of the world around you and desire to understand that something, things that small children have.
Well, there's a wonderful Geological Society publication about all the ways in which you can use the fossil record to show why climate change is real, and may actually tend to the upside or the downside, i.e. faster warming of predictions, by looking all the way through the fossil records and seeing analogies for what we're facing, because climate has varied in some cases, not because of fossil fuels, but volcanic activity, through the ebb and flow of CO2 in the atmosphere. And being able to illustrate that, one, of course, I don't think we have many skeptics yet to convince in the UK, but at least it brings you up sharp and possibly galvanizes society more to do what I think many of the speakers have suggested. It's really quite tough, what we're asking to do. Everybody's saying we can do it. Everybody is wanting to be on the optimistic side, but it's a challenge, and without everybody working together on this, not just and that's why, including the oil and gas companies, but lots of other people as well. I know that we should not, or I say we, but I obviously got a foot in both camps at the moment. I think that that's something that we should do on our own, because the role of governments, the role of industrial policy, the role of supranational bodies is going to be critical. It's just not going to happen through market economics.
Well, thank you. I'm very, very, very aware of time because we need to hand back to be able to finish it at 4:30. I do maybe just have a short answer question to one final common theme that was coming up in the Q&As. And that was around how the industry is responding to the energy transition, and in particular, where are the opportunities? Are the opportunities here already in the context of kind of recent graduates, or those who have suffered from the economic impacts of COVID? And another attendee asked about how to start a career in the energy transition as a geoscientist. So are there opportunities? Short answer question. Or when are they coming? Are there opportunities and when are they coming?
We'll leave the last word to Roz. I believe so. Look, we still need to sympathetically produce oil and gas and mine metals. So, doing that in an environmentally sensitive way is important. But beyond that, there's a lot we still don't understand. We keep talking about carbon capture and storage as a proven technology. It's not. And it still has a difficult image problem for many reasons, because it feels like kind of a sort of form of getting away with rubbish. It's not a recycling aim, and so I think we need to get working on that. But I also think, you know, all the other things I mentioned up front, there's a lot of things that geology can contribute to, and you know, and the broad sweep of environmental science involves the rocks as well, and you don't need to start from just being an environmental scientist. You can come into it from a background in rocks. So yeah, yeah, why not?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to quickly say is that if nothing else, there's masses of policy challenges as we've discussed in all of this, and there'll be a lot of policy jobs and sort of roles for people interested in trying to crack the policy. So I'll plug for people who are kind of policy geeks like me, and that's also an opportunity if you find this stuff fascinating. But obviously the technical roles are hugely important too.
I think one of the things that's come out of today is not only understanding that this is a multifaceted problem, and we need people from all disciplines, and geoscientists working with people from all disciplines. Very cognizant of time, that was very naughty of me to ask that last question, but I thought it was quite important to talk about like where those opportunities are and when they're coming for the recent graduates or people looking to move into this area. So with that, thank you very much, both of you, for spending that time with us. Really valuable discussion. Really important to hear your views from your roles and your experience and the perspectives that you can offer. So thank you very much, Ros and Andrew. And I'm going to hand back over to Mike to close out the event today.
Great job, Jen. Thank you very much. Some interesting thoughts about how to draw people into geology and a bigger appreciation of our natural world there. On that, just before I close off this, this weekend I was reading a book with my grandson, who's just 3, and we were talking about giraffes. And I asked him, why do they have long necks? And he sort of thought for a while, and he said, I don't know. And I said, well, they eat leaves from trees, and it allows them to get to the top of the trees. And he looked at me and said, like a herbivore dinosaur. And I just thought, oh my God, you know, this guy knows dinosaurs are herbivores and carnivores. And I didn't know that when I was 3. Lots of crazy things get taught in school today. And it is all about capturing the imagination of people. And this guy is, like many kids of his age, are really taken with the notion of dinosaurs. Anyway, that is slightly off-piste. To close, and on behalf of the Society, I'd just like to say a big thank you and acknowledge people who've been involved in this. Andrew for his great opening words and the panel participation, and revealing his poetic dimension as well as his corporate one. The conveners for organising such a stimulating start to this 3-part series. Our guests and speakers for making it insightful, hugely accessible and engaging. And you, the attendees, of the ones that have left you, who for sticking with us. Finally, Becky Goddard, who put this effective and trouble-free virtual event together. Big thank you, Becky. So finally, please note that part 2 of the series will be coming up in early June, 7th or 8th of June. So don't miss it.